There is a stretch of time in the history of Britain that almost no one talks about, not because nothing happened, but because the records vanished. 200 years, from roughly 410 AD to around 600 AD, where the written evidence for one of the most important islands on Earth goes nearly completely dark. What comes out the other side is unrecognizable. Different language, different religion, different people, different everything. Someone took an eraser to Britain and pressed, and when the dust settled, almost nothing remained to explain what had happened. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now, let us go back. Not to the comfortable history you learned in school, the tidy version where Romans left, Saxons arrived, and everything more or less sorted itself out. That version is a story built on fragments, assumptions, and a few texts written centuries after the events they describe. The real story is stranger, darker, and far more fascinating. It is a story about a civilization that vanished, about people who simply stopped writing, about a silence so total and so complete that even the word we use for it, the Dark Ages, barely captures how disorienting it truly is when you stand inside it and try to look around. We are going to spend a very long time inside that silence tonight. We are going to pull apart every fragment of evidence that survives, every bone, every buried object, every suspicious absence, every half-remembered name in a later chronicle, every place name that hints at something older underneath. And by the end of it, you are not going to have neat answers, because the honest truth is that no one does. What you are going to have is something rarer and more valuable than neat answers. You are going to understand why those 200 years matter more to the story of the British Isles than almost any other period in recorded history, and why the silence itself is the most telling thing of all. So, Britain, Roman Britain, to be specific. By the 4th century AD, this is a fully integrated province of the Roman Empire. It has roads, it has towns, it has baths and forums and temples. It has a coin economy. It has Latin-speaking administrators and merchants and soldiers. The town of Londinium has tens of thousands of residents. Verulamium, which is modern St. Albans, is a busy, prosperous urban centre with a theatre. Bath is a resort destination. York is a military headquarters of such importance that multiple Roman emperors came here personally. This is not some distant frontier outpost. This is a functioning piece of a civilization that spans from Scotland to the Sahara, and then something begins to happen. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, over the course of the late 4th and very early 5th centuries, the Roman world starts to come apart at the seams. The pressures are immense and coming from every direction. The empire has been splitting into eastern and western halves. The currency has been debased. The army has been stretched so thin across so many frontiers that there are not enough soldiers to go around. And in 406 AD, a massive coalition of Germanic peoples, Vandals and Suebi and Alans, crosses the frozen Rhine River and pours into Gaul, which is modern France. This is not a raid. This is a migration. And it cuts the land route between Britain and the rest of the empire. The legions in Britain, watching this happen, do what soldiers without a strong central command often do. They start making their own emperors, 3 usurpers in quick succession. The last of them, a man named Constantine III, takes much of the remaining Roman military force in Britain and crosses to Gaul to try to stabilize things. He does not succeed. He is eventually executed. But the troops he took never came back. In 410 AD, the city of Rome itself is sacked by Alaric and his Visigoths. The Emperor Honorius, hiding in Ravenna, is so consumed by the catastrophe on the continent that he reportedly sends a letter to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defense. Historians have debated whether this letter is even genuine, but the symbolism is almost too perfect. The empire, officially, is washing its hands of Britain. Whether any formal notice was sent or not, the practical reality is the same. The money to pay the army has stopped. The administrative machinery that kept the towns running is grinding to a halt. The supply chains that fed and equipped the military garrisons are severed, and Britain, in the early years of the 5th century, is on its own. Now, here is where the story should continue. Here is where we should be able to follow what happens next, year by year, name by name, event by event. Here is where the historical record should pick up and walk us through the transition from Roman Britain to whatever comes next. But it does not. The written record drops off a cliff. There are a few texts. There is a British monk named Gildas who writes something called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, which translates roughly as On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. He writes it sometime in the mid-6th century, probably around 540 AD, so roughly 130 years after the Romans leave. He is not a historian in any modern sense. He is a preacher. He is furious. He writes to condemn the kings of his own time for their wickedness and their failures. He uses history as a weapon, reaching back to describe how Britain fell into sin and disaster, but his account is vague, his dates are unreliable, and he is writing about events that happened a century before his own lifetime from sources we cannot verify. There is the Venerable Bede, a monk in Northumbria, who writes his ecclesiastical history of the English people in 731 AD. Bede is a far more careful scholar than Gildas. He tries to cross-reference his sources. He is genuinely interested in accuracy. But he is also writing 300 years after the period we are looking at, and much of what he knows about the 5th and 6th centuries comes from Gildas and from oral tradition and from documents that no longer exist. He is reconstructing a past that is already deeply obscure to him. And then there is the Historia Britonum, the history of the Britons, attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius, probably written around 828 AD, 400 years after the events it describes. This is the text that gives us the earliest written appearance of the name Arthur. And even Nennius himself seems to know he is working with unreliable material. The opening of his text contains a phrase that translates roughly as, "I have made a heap of all I found," which is either the most honest thing any historian has ever written about their methodology, or a warning that what follows should be read with considerable skepticism. So those are our main written sources for this 200-year period. A furious preacher writing 130 years after the fact, a careful monk writing 300 years after the fact, and a compiler making a heap of whatever he could find 400 years after the fact. None of them were there. None of them had access to contemporary written records from this period because, as far as we can tell, almost none were kept, or, if they were kept, they did not survive. Why? That is one of the first questions worth sitting with. Why do the written records stop? Part of the answer is obvious and structural. Writing in Roman Britain was a bureaucratic and administrative activity. It required people who were trained in Latin. It required a supply chain for materials like papyrus, which was imported from Egypt, and later vellum, which was made from animal skins. It required institutions, churches, and government offices and law courts that created and preserved documents, as, when those institutions collapse, the writing stops. There is no one to do it and no infrastructure to support it. But that explanation, while true, does not fully satisfy, because even after Rome withdraws, there are still people in Britain who can write Latin. There are still Christian communities. There are still, presumably, literate individuals scattered around the landscape. Some of them must have experienced the events of the 5th century firsthand. Why do we not hear from them? Part of the answer may be that documents were created but did not survive. Papyrus is extremely vulnerable to the damp British climate. Vellum survives better, but it is still organic material, susceptible to fire, flooding, and the simple passage of time. The monasteries that would have been the primary guardians of such documents are disrupted during the upheavals of the 5th and 6th centuries. Some are destroyed outright. The infrastructure for preserving written material simply did not exist in the same robust way during this period. But here is another possibility, one that is darker and more interesting. Perhaps there simply was not much happening that the people who could write chose to write about. Perhaps the experience of living through this period was so chaotic, so fragmented, so unlike anything that had come before, that the usual frameworks for historical record-keeping did not apply. Roman historical writing was a genre with conventions and audiences and purposes. In the post-Roman world, those conventions have dissolved. Who is the audience? Who is paying for the scribes? What institutions are commissioning the histories? The answer, for most of this 200-year period, seems to be no one. And so the silence falls. And what fills the silence is archaeology. This is where things get genuinely fascinating, because what the archaeology tells us about 5th and 6th century Britain is deeply strange and deeply contested. And the strangest thing of all is what it does not show us. The things that are absent are as telling as the things that are present. Consider the towns. Roman Britain's towns were substantial places. Londinium, Verulamium, Camulodunum, which is modern Colchester, Aquae Sulis, which is Bath, Eboracum, which is York. These were places with stone buildings, paved streets, sewage systems, public baths, markets, temples, all the physical infrastructure of Roman urban life. And then, from the early 5th century onward, something extraordinary happens to them. They begin to empty out. The archaeology of 5th century Britain's towns is remarkable for what it reveals about how quickly and completely urban life collapses. Coins stop being deposited. This matters enormously, because coins are one of the most sensitive indicators of economic activity that archaeologists have. Where there are coins, there are markets, there is trade, there is a functioning money economy. In Roman Britain, coins are everywhere. In 5th century Britain, they become vanishingly rare, and by the mid-5th century, they have essentially stopped appearing altogether. The coin supply to Britain appears to have dried up around 402 to 410 AD, and it does not resume in any meaningful way for another 200 years. Think about what that means. For 200 years, the people of Britain appear to have been operating without a coin-based economy. Barter, tribute, gift exchange, subsistence farming. The sophisticated market economy of Roman Britain, with its long-distance trade networks and its specialist producers and its urban markets, simply ceases to function. And the buildings. The stone buildings of Roman Britain's towns are not demolished. They are not torn down and replaced. They are simply abandoned, left to collapse slowly. Grass grows through the floors of forums. Roofs fall in. The elaborate hypercaust heating systems, which required constant maintenance to function, fail and are never repaired. Squatters move into some of the ruins, but there is no attempt to maintain the urban fabric. There is no reconstruction in stone. The great physical achievement of Roman Britain, its towns, its civic architecture, its infrastructure, just sits there and slowly returns to the earth. What replaces it? Almost nothing in terms of substantial permanent structures. The archaeology of the 5th and 6th centuries, in what had been Roman Britain's urban centres, shows occasional timber structures, rough and impermanent, fitted into the ruins of stone buildings. It shows evidence of small-scale metalworking and agricultural activity. It shows, in places like Wroxeter in Shropshire, what appears to be a continuing population occupying the remains of the Roman town in a drastically simplified way. But it does not show continuity of urban life in any recognizable sense. Wroxeter is particularly interesting and particularly debated. Some archaeologists have interpreted the evidence there as suggesting that someone, possibly a local ruler of some kind, was maintaining a functioning community in the town into the 5th century, constructing timber buildings on Roman foundations, possibly preserving some kind of administrative or military function. The evidence is tantalizing but ambiguous. What is clear is that even at Wroxeter, by the 6th century, the settlement has contracted dramatically and lost most of its urban character. The countryside tells a different story, and in some ways an even stranger one. Rural settlement in Roman Britain was itself diverse and complex. There were villas, the great agricultural estates of the wealthy, with their mosaic floors and their bathhouses. There were smaller farms. There were native-style roundhouses that had continued operating throughout the Roman period in areas less thoroughly Romanized. And there were the managed agricultural landscapes, the field systems and drains and tracks that underpinned the food production of the whole province. What happens to all of this after 410 AD is one of the great puzzles of British archaeology. The villas, like the towns, show a pattern of abandonment and collapse. Some of them appear to have been abandoned quite suddenly in the early 5th century. Others show signs of continuing occupation in degraded form, floors covered with debris, rooms subdivided, bathhouses no longer functioning. A few appear to have continued in some kind of use well into the 5th century, possibly longer. But the villa as a concept, as a form of elite residence tied to a particular kind of Romanized culture and economy, essentially disappears. The field systems are more complicated. There is evidence that some of the agricultural landscape of Roman Britain continued to be farmed through the 5th and 6th centuries. The countryside was not empty. People were still living on it, still growing food. But the character of that agricultural activity changed. The market-oriented surplus production that fed the Roman towns and supplied the Roman military began to give way to more localized subsistence farming. Without the coin economy and without the urban markets, there was no incentive and no mechanism for the kind of specialized surplus production that had characterized Roman rural Britain. And then there are the people themselves. Who were they? What happened to them? This is where the debate becomes most intense, most contested, and most politically charged. Because the question of what happened to the population of Roman Britain when the Romans left and the Saxons arrived sits at the heart of arguments about English identity, about the nature of conquest and colonization, about who the English really are and where they came from. The traditional story, the one that dominated historical thinking for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, went something like this. The Romans left. The native Britons, unable to defend themselves, were overwhelmed by waves of Germanic invaders from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. These invaders killed or drove out the native population, pushing the survivors west into Wales and Cornwall and north into Scotland. The English are thus descended primarily from these Germanic newcomers, not from the Britons who preceded them. The English language, the English culture, English everything, comes from the Anglo-Saxons. This story was enormously influential. It shaped how English identity was understood for centuries. It had political uses. The Victorians loved it. The idea of the Anglo-Saxon as the foundational stock of the English race was central to a lot of Victorian racial ideology. But modern archaeology and modern genetics have complicated this picture enormously, and the complications are both fascinating and troubling. Let us start with the genetics. In the early 21st century, the ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA from skeletal remains has transformed our understanding of population history in ways that would have been inconceivable to earlier generations of historians. And what the ancient DNA evidence from Britain suggests is genuinely surprising. Studies published in the 2010s and 2020s, analyzing skeletal remains from sites across England, have found clear evidence of genetic change between the Roman period and the early medieval period. In eastern and southeastern England, the areas closest to the continent and most heavily settled by incoming Germanic peoples, the genetic profiles of early medieval populations show substantial ancestry that is traceable to northwestern continental Europe, specifically to the regions that are now the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark. In some areas of eastern England, the genetic turnover is quite dramatic. The incoming continental ancestry appears to account for a large proportion of the post-Roman population. But in other areas, particularly in the west and the north, the picture is different. Here, populations show much greater genetic continuity with the pre-Roman and Roman period Britons. The incoming continental ancestry is less predominant. There are more people who are genetically more similar to the ancient populations of Wales and Scotland and Ireland, people whose ancestry traces back to the earlier Neolithic and Bronze Age inhabitants of these islands. What does this mean? It means that the traditional story of simple replacement, everyone killed or expelled and replaced by Germanic newcomers, is too simple. What actually happened was geographically varied and far more complex. In some areas, there was indeed very substantial incoming population from the continent. In others, the native population persisted much more strongly. The picture is not one of wholesale replacement, but of a patchwork, with different outcomes in different regions. But here is the puzzle that the genetics cannot fully resolve. Even in areas where the native genetic ancestry is strong, the cultural markers of the incoming Germanic peoples become dominant. The language that eventually develops across most of what is now England is Anglo-Saxon, a Germanic language. The material culture, the pottery, the jewelry styles, the burial practices, the settlement forms, all become recognizably similar to what you find in continental Germanic contexts. So how do you end up with people who are partly or largely descended from native Britons but who are culturally and linguistically Anglo-Saxon? This is one of the deepest puzzles of the period. And to address it, we need to think about how cultural change actually works. Because the naive assumption, the assumption built into the old replacement narrative, is that culture follows people. You change the people, you change the culture, but history is full of examples where culture changes without full population replacement. Sometimes an incoming minority can impose its language and culture on a numerically larger native population if that minority holds political and military power. The Normans did something like this in England after 1066. A relatively small number of French-speaking Norman nobles ended up transforming the entire cultural and linguistic landscape of England, even though they never came close to replacing the native English population in numerical terms. Could something similar have happened in the 5th and 6th centuries? Could a relatively smaller number of incoming Anglo-Saxon warriors and settlers have established themselves as a dominant elite, and then, over generations, the native population adopted their language and culture as a strategy for survival and advancement? This is the model that many historians now favor for at least some parts of Britain, but it too has its problems. Because the genetic evidence from some parts of eastern England suggests the incoming population was not a small elite minority, but a very substantial proportion of the total population. The truth is probably that different things happened in different places. In some coastal areas of eastern England, perhaps the genuine population dynamics looked something like the old replacement model, massive incoming migration that numerically dominated the native population. In other areas, perhaps you had something more like the elite dominance model, a smaller incoming group that established political and military control and drew the native population into their cultural sphere over time. And in the west and the far north, perhaps the native population remained dominant throughout, maintaining their own language and culture, even as they were cut off from the former centers of power. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how any of this could have happened, we need to understand what Britain was actually like in the decades immediately after the Roman departure. Because the idea of a simple vacuum waiting to be filled by incoming Germanic peoples is wrong. Britain, in 410 AD, is not empty. It is full of people who had been living there for generations. People who, in many cases, had never thought of themselves primarily as Roman at all. People who had their own languages, their own kinship networks, their own traditions and loyalties. And those people had to figure out how to survive and organize themselves without the structures that Rome had provided. What happens in the immediate post-Roman period appears to be a fragmentation of political authority and a reassertion of local power. The governing structures of Roman Britain had been centralized and hierarchical. The governor, the administrative districts, the tax collectors, the legal system, all of this vanishes quite rapidly once the central imperial authority withdraws. What fills the gap is local strongmen, local councils, local religious authorities, the big men of individual valleys and river systems and hill country regions asserting themselves and building followings. We can glimpse some of this in the place names. Britain's landscape is full of names that preserve traces of this period. Many of these names are deeply puzzling because they do not fit neatly into either the Latin or the Germanic naming conventions that dominate either side of the period. They suggest a fluid, contested landscape where different languages and different peoples were claiming different territories, and we can glimpse it in the hill forts. This is one of the most striking things that the archaeology shows us about the immediate post-Roman period: hill forts. Ancient defensive sites that had been built during the Iron Age, before the Romans came, and that had generally fallen out of use during the Roman centuries, began to be reoccupied and refortified in the 5th and 6th centuries. Sites like South Cadbury in Somerset, which has been associated, possibly fancifully, with the legend of Camelot, show evidence of substantial activity in this period. The defences were rebuilt. A large timber hall was constructed inside the ramparts. Someone was using this ancient hilltop site as a power centre. Why hill forts? Because they are defensible. Because in a landscape where central authority has collapsed and every valley is potentially hostile, the high places with good visibility and strong natural defences become the logical places to establish control. The Roman preference was for towns in valleys, connected by roads, supplied by river traffic. That preference made sense in a landscape where security was provided by a professional army and where communication and trade were the priorities. In the fragmenting landscape of 5th century Britain, different priorities apply. But who was sitting in those hill forts? Who was the strongman commanding the rebuilt ramparts of South Cadbury? We do not know. We do not know his name, we do not know his language, we do not know his genealogy. The silence swallows him completely. He exists only as a shadow in the archaeological record, a post-hole pattern, a layer of charred timber, a scattering of 5th century pottery. And here we arrive at the figure that haunts this entire period more than any other. The figure who has been both the most discussed and the least understood. The figure who has been transformed by legend into something so mythologically powerful that it is almost impossible to see the historical reality, if any reality exists, underneath. Arthur. We have to talk about Arthur. We cannot possibly spend this long inside the Saxon Silence without talking about Arthur. But we also have to be honest about what the evidence actually says, which is both less and more than most people expect. The name Arthur appears, in the historical sources, very late. The earliest reference to someone called Arthur in a military context comes from the Historia Brittonum, Nennius's heap of whatever he could find, written around 828 AD. That is 400 years after the period in question. Nennius describes Arthur not as a king but as a dux bellorum, a leader of battles. He lists 12 battles that Arthur supposedly fought, culminating in the Battle of Badon Hill, where he is said to have killed 960 men in a single charge. That number alone tells you this is not straightforward historical reportage. The Battle of Badon Hill itself, Mons Badonicus, is mentioned in the earlier source, Gildas, and this is significant. Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century, mentions a great British victory against the Saxons at Badon Hill as an event within living memory or shortly before. He dates it to approximately the year of his birth, which he places around 500 AD. So there is very likely a real battle at Badon Hill sometime around 500 AD, a real British military victory over the incoming Germanic peoples. Gildas is angry and rhetorical and vague about many things, but this event seems to have been real. But here is the thing. Gildas does not mention Arthur. He describes the Battle of Badon Hill. He describes the aftermath, a period of relative peace. He mentions the leader who won the battle, a man named Ambrosius Aurelianus. But Arthur's name does not appear. If Arthur was the great military leader of the Britons in this period, why does Gildas not mention him? Gildas is hostile to many people, but he names the people he is hostile to. Arthur's absence from Gildas is one of the central puzzles of Arthurian studies. There are explanations. Gildas is not writing comprehensive history. He is writing a sermon. He mentions only the people relevant to his theological and political arguments. Arthur might have existed and simply not been relevant to what Gildas was trying to say. This is possible. It is also possible that Arthur did not exist, or that Arthur is a title or a composite figure rather than a single historical individual, or that the traditions about Arthur developed from real events and real people, but became attached to a name and a narrative that does not correspond to any single historical person. What we can say with some confidence is this. Something happened around 500 AD. The incoming Germanic settlement, which had been advancing steadily through the latter part of the 5th century, appears to have been checked. The archaeological evidence suggests that the Saxon expansion into Britain slowed or halted for a generation or two around this time. There is a period of apparent stabilization, possibly corresponding to Gildas's description of the peace after Badon. Then, in the later 6th century, the expansion resumes and the Germanic kingdoms begin to consolidate their control over most of what is now England. Whether a single figure named Arthur was responsible for the victory at Badon, we simply do not know. But the fact that the legend grew so large and so powerful, the fact that Arthur became the central organizing myth of British identity for centuries afterward, tells us something important. It tells us that the people who lived through and after this period felt the need for a story about a great leader who had resisted the tide, who had held the line, who had, for a time, turned back what felt like the end of the world. Because that is what this period felt like to the people living through it. The end of a world. Think about what it meant to be a Romanized Briton in the 5th century. Your grandfather, perhaps, had served in the Roman army. Your family spoke Latin at home, or at least in formal contexts. Your town had a forum, a bathhouse, temples with marble columns. You used coins. You traded with merchants who traveled from Gaul and Spain and the Mediterranean. You were, in a meaningful sense, a citizen of an empire that had been the organizing framework of the known world for 400 years. And then, in the space of a single lifetime, all of that just stops. The coins stop, the merchants stop coming, the officials stop collecting taxes and administering justice and maintaining the roads. The army is gone, the bathhouse falls into disrepair, the forum begins to crumble, the tiles fall from the roof, and no one replaces them. And out on the eastern coasts, ships are arriving carrying people who speak a language you cannot understand, who are not interested in your towns or your forums or your Latin, who are establishing their own settlements and their own power structures. What do? Some people tried to maintain the old ways. We can see this in the archaeological record. There are sites in the west of Britain where Roman material culture persisted much later than in the east, where Latin continued to be used, at least in certain elite and ecclesiastical contexts, where the memory and the forms of Roman civilization were preserved, transformed, but recognizable. The Christian Church played a crucial role in this. The Church was, in some ways, the most durable institution to survive the collapse of Roman Britain. It had its own organizational structure. It had its literate clergy. It had its traditions of record-keeping and its connections to the wider Christian world, to Rome, to Gaul, to Ireland. In the west of Britain, in Wales, and in what is now southwest England, Christianity persisted through the 5th and 6th centuries and became one of the primary vehicles for preserving whatever remained of Romanized British culture. The saints of this period, the Welsh saints, the Irish missionaries who crisscross this era, are extraordinary figures. Many of them are barely distinguishable from legend, but they represent a genuine attempt to maintain civilization in the midst of collapse. The monasteries that emerged in Western Britain and in Ireland during the 5th and 6th centuries became the primary repositories of whatever learning survived. They copied texts, they maintained schools, they kept some form of intellectual culture alive. And from Ireland and from these Western British monasteries, the Christian mission eventually turned around and went back east, back into the territories that had been swallowed by the pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This is the story of figures like Columba, who establishes a monastery on the island of Iona off the west coast of Scotland in 563 AD, and whose missionaries eventually reached the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, and of Augustine of Canterbury, sent from Rome in 597 AD to convert the Anglo-Saxon kings, who arrives in Kent and begins the process of bringing the Germanic kingdoms of England into the Christian fold. These events, in the late 6th and early 7th century, mark the beginning of the end of the Saxon Silence, because with Christianity comes literacy, with literacy comes record-keeping, and suddenly we can hear voices again. But what happened in the 200 years between the Roman departure and this renewed literacy? That is the question that keeps historians and archaeologists and geneticists and place-name scholars and literary scholars arguing with each other across centuries of scholarly debate. And the answer is not simple, and it is not finished. Let us talk about language, because language is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding population history and cultural change. And the linguistic history of Britain during the Saxon Silence is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of any language. When the Romans arrived in Britain, the population spoke various forms of Celtic languages, the Brittonic branch of the Celtic family. These were languages related to what is now Welsh and Cornish and Breton, the languages of Brittany in France, where British refugees settled in large numbers during the 5th and 6th centuries. Latin was imposed and adopted in urban and administrative contexts and among the elite, but the mass of the rural population likely continued to speak Brittonic languages throughout the Roman period. After the Romans left and the Germanic settlements began, something extraordinary happened. Within a few centuries, most of the territory that is now England had adopted a Germanic language, Old English, as its primary tongue. The Brittonic languages retreated to the fringes, to Wales and Cornwall and southern Scotland, and, in a modified form, to Brittany. In the heartland of what had been Roman Britain, the Celtic languages essentially vanished. This linguistic transformation is one of the most dramatic and least well-understood events in the history of the British Isles, because languages do not change this way without reason. A language that has been spoken in a territory for centuries does not simply disappear without the community of speakers either dying out or very thoroughly adopting the new language. And yet that appears to be what happened. The conventional explanation again invokes population replacement. If enough Anglo-Saxon settlers came in and displaced or killed the native population, the language would simply change because there were more speakers of the new language than the old one. And, in the most heavily settled areas, this may have been what happened. But there is another possibility, a more socially driven explanation. If speaking Anglo-Saxon became associated with power, with status, with access to land and resources and security, then native Britons might have adopted it strategically, even if they were not displaced. Just as many colonized peoples throughout history have adopted the language of the colonizer, not because they were forced to at knife point, but because doing so opened doors that would otherwise be closed to them, the Britons who survived the Saxon settlement may have found that adopting the language of the new rulers was the practical path to survival. The problem with this explanation is that it should have left traces in the language. When a population adopts a new language while maintaining their old one in private or in certain contexts, they typically leave marks on the new language. Loanwords, phonological features, grammatical patterns borrowed from the substrate language. This is called the substrate effect, and it is visible in many languages. English itself shows this in its borrowing from Norse and Norman French after later waves of immigration. But Old English shows remarkably few traces of Brittonic substrate influence. There are some loanwords, mostly relating to geography and landscape. There are a very few grammatical features that some linguists have argued might reflect Brittonic influence. But the overall picture is of a language that arrived and established itself with relatively little contamination from the language it replaced. And this is one of the arguments used to support the population replacement model, because if you really had a large native population switching languages, you would expect more substrate influence than we see. This is a genuine puzzle. It does not have a satisfying resolution. The linguistic evidence points toward replacement in a way that the genetic evidence from some regions does not fully support. We are left, again, with a picture that is complicated and regional and probably reflects very different dynamics in different parts of the country. Let us travel across the landscape of 5th and 6th century Britain and look at some specific places and what they can tell us. Start in Kent, the southeastern corner of England, just across the Channel from the continent. This is one of the areas most thoroughly and most rapidly settled by incoming Germanic peoples. The archaeological evidence from Kent in the 5th and 6th centuries is strikingly Germanic. The pottery is Germanic, the jewellery is Germanic, the burial customs are Germanic. The graves of 5th century Kent look more like graves from across the North Sea than like anything from the previous Roman period. Whatever happened here, it happened fast, and it happened thoroughly. Genetic analysis of early medieval Kentish populations shows substantial continental Germanic ancestry. The incoming settlement was clearly massive. Kent, in the post-Roman period, is, in terms of its material culture and its population genetics, essentially a transplanted piece of northwestern Europe. But even here, there are complexities. The historical tradition says that Kent was settled by the Jutes, a people from what is now the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark, but the material culture of early Anglo-Saxon Kent does not look particularly Jutish. It looks more like a mixture of influences from across the North Sea coast. And there are hints in the archaeology and in the place names that some level of continuity with the previous population persisted even in this most thoroughly Germanicized area. Move west, and the picture changes. The Thames Valley shows a complicated pattern. In the lower Thames region, Germanic settlement is early and substantial. Further up the valley, the transition is slower and less complete. There are sites where the evidence suggests a gradual cultural change rather than an abrupt replacement, Roman and Germanic styles appearing together and blending before the Germanic becomes dominant. Go further west still, into the Severn Valley and the West Midlands, and the archaeology becomes much more ambiguous. Here, the evidence for early Germanic settlement is thinner. The native material culture persists longer. The transition to Anglo-Saxon culture happens later and perhaps more gradually. This is the region that was probably home to some of the post-Roman British kingdoms, the kingdoms that appear in later Welsh tradition under names like Powys and Gwent and Erging. These are territories where British political authority may have survived through much of the 5th and 6th centuries before being eventually absorbed into the expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And then there is the far west, Wales, Cornwall, the Devon Peninsula. Here, the British language and culture survived intact, not as a remnant, but as a living tradition. These areas were never conquered by the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the early medieval period. They maintained their own kings, their own language, their own traditions. Welsh is a direct descendant of the Brittonic language that was spoken across Britain before the Romans came. It survived because the people who spoke it survived and maintained political control of their territory. The same story, with variations, applies to the north. The region north of Hadrian's Wall, what is now Scotland, was never fully incorporated into Roman Britain, even at the height of the empire's power. The Caledonians and the Picts and the Scots maintained their independence throughout the Roman period. In the post-Roman centuries, these northern territories remained outside the orbit of Anglo-Saxon settlement. The Picts in the northeast, the Scots in the west, a Gaelic-speaking people who had migrated from Ireland, and the Brittonic kingdoms of the Old Wall Zone, like Reged and Gododin, all maintained distinct identities through the 5th and 6th centuries. The kingdom of Gododin is particularly interesting. Based around the old Roman fortress at Edinburgh, this was a Brittonic kingdom that survived into the late 6th and early 7th century. And we know about it because of a poem, one of the oldest surviving poems in any British language. The poem called Why Gododin, preserved in Welsh, describes a raid by the warriors of Gododin against the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Deira in Northumbria, probably around 600 AD. The raid fails. Almost all the warriors are killed, and the poem commemorates their deaths. The poem contains what may be the earliest reference to Arthur in any source. A warrior is praised by being compared to Arthur, with the note that he was not Arthur, implying that Arthur was already famous as a standard of military excellence. But this comparison is almost certainly a later addition to the text. The poem itself was probably composed around 600 AD, but was written down much later, and it is impossible to know exactly when the Arthur reference was inserted. Still, the poem is remarkable. It is a genuinely early document from this period, composed by a warrior culture that is directly engaged in the conflicts between British and Anglo-Saxon peoples. It gives us something precious, an actual voice from close to the Saxon Silence, speaking in a language that is recognizably ancestral to modern Welsh, describing real men fighting real battles in a real landscape. And it is a lament. The warriors of Gododin went to fight, and they died, and the kingdom that sent them eventually fell. By the mid-7th century, most of Northumbria had been swallowed by the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Bernicia and Deira. The Brittonic kingdoms of the north, one by one, were absorbed or destroyed. The process was not quick, it was not simple, it was not clean. It took 200 years, and it happened differently in different places, and it left a landscape that was neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic, but something genuinely new, something that had never existed before. The people who lived through it were not passive. They were not simply victims of history. They were making choices, forming alliances, switching allegiances, adopting new languages and new customs, maintaining old traditions in new forms, surviving. And the silence in the record is not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It is the silence of people who did not write things down in forms that could survive the chaos of their times. They had stories, they had memories, they had traditions. The stories became legend, the memories became myth, the traditions became the folklore of the medieval Welsh and English alike. Some of those memories became genuinely extraordinary. There is a tradition in medieval Welsh literature of something called the triads, lists of threes, groups of 3 kings or heroes, or events that are said to be the most notable of their kind. The triads preserve names and events from the post-Roman period that appear nowhere else. They mention kingdoms and battles and conflicts that the later written history barely touches. Whether these traditions preserve genuine memories of the 5th and 6th centuries, or whether they are constructions of later medieval Welsh literary culture, is a matter of endless debate. But they hint at a rich oral tradition that existed in the silence, carrying memories that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The landscape itself became a kind of memory. Place names, British place names that survived even in areas otherwise thoroughly Germanicized. The River Thames, the River Severn, the River Avon. Several rivers in England are still called Avon, because it is simply the Brittonic word for river, Afon. These surviving names are like ghosts. They are the voices of people who lived in this landscape and gave these places their names, voices that persist even when everything else about those people has vanished. And some of the place names carry something more specific. There are place names in England that contain the element wal or wallas, from the Old English word that the Anglo-Saxons used to refer to the native Britons. The word that eventually gives us Wales and Welsh, and also Walloon and Vlach and Wallachia, and all the other derivatives of a Germanic root word meaning foreigner, or more specifically, speaker of a Romance language. These place names like Walton and Walcott and Walbrook, and dozens of others, scattered across the English landscape, mark places that were identified in the Anglo-Saxon period as being associated with the Britons. They are markers of a presence that was recognized and named and mapped, even by the people who were displacing them. Some of these places may mark the locations of British communities that survived in enclaves within the Anglo-Saxon-controlled landscape, not in the West, where British political authority maintained itself, but in the heartland, in the areas most thoroughly settled by Germanic peoples, small communities of Britons clinging to patches of land, recognized as different, named with a word that meant other. The legal codes of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms tell us something important about this. The law codes of Ine, King of Wessex in the late 7th century, include provisions for Welsh people living within his kingdom. Welsh people meaning Britons, native inhabitants of the territory. These are not immigrants. These are people who were already there when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were established, who were surviving within the new social and political order, but with a different and subordinate legal status. The law assigns different wergild, the blood price paid for killing someone, to Britons and to Saxons. The Briton's life is valued lower than the Saxons. This is the language of conquest codified into law. But the existence of these provisions tells us something important. There were enough surviving Britons within Ine's kingdom that the law code needed to address them explicitly. They were not a negligible remnant. They were a recognized population with defined legal standing, even if that standing was inferior. So the picture that emerges from all these fragmentary sources, the genetic evidence and the archaeology and the place names and the law codes and the hints in later texts, is one of enormous complexity. The 200-year period of the Saxon Silence was not a simple story of replacement. It was a process of collision and accommodation and transformation and survival, playing out differently in different places, producing a landscape at the end of it that was neither what it had been at the beginning, nor what any of the participants might have planned or predicted. And there is one more element we need to consider, one more force that was operating through this entire period. One more actor whose role was shaping events even as the silence fell over the landscape. Plague. Disease. In 541 AD, near the very end of our period of silence, the first great pandemic of the medieval world struck. The plague of Justinian, caused by the same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death of the 14th century, Yersinia pestis, arrived in the Mediterranean world and devastated it. The plague reached Britain. The Irish annals record outbreaks that are consistent with the spread of the pandemic. The effect on the population of Britain at this critical juncture in the formation of the new order is unknown, but it was almost certainly significant. But the Justinianic plague was the culmination of a longer process. There is growing evidence that the collapse of Roman civilization in the West was accompanied by, and perhaps partly caused by, a series of disease events. The Roman Empire had been struck by devastating pandemics in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Antonine Plague of the 160s and 170s AD, and the Plague of Cyprian in the 250s AD, may have killed millions of people across the empire and contributed significantly to the demographic and economic crisis that weakened Rome's ability to defend its frontiers. Closer to our period, there is evidence of what some climate scientists have called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of significant cooling and volcanic forcing in the 5th and 6th centuries. Massive volcanic eruptions, possibly in 535 and 536 AD, created a dust veil that reduced temperatures across the northern hemisphere, disrupted agriculture, caused harvest failures, and may have contributed to the wave of pestilence that followed. Tree ring evidence from across Europe shows a dramatic narrowing of growth rings in the mid-6th century, consistent with a sustained period of poor growing conditions. Disease, climate, and collapse These forces were operating across the entire post-Roman world simultaneously. Britain was not uniquely affected. The whole Western Mediterranean, Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Italy itself, were all experiencing similar processes of political fragmentation, demographic decline, and cultural transformation. But Britain's insularity and its position at the far northwestern edge of the Roman world meant that the collapse here was in some ways more complete than elsewhere, and the recovery more slow. When the written record begins to return, in the late 6th and early 7th century, it does so in the context of the growing power of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the spread of Christianity among them. The two processes are intertwined. Kings who converted to Christianity gained access to literate clergy who could write and keep records, who could help them administer their kingdoms, who could write laudatory accounts of their reigns. The Kingdom of Kent, under King Ethelbert, is converted by Augustine's mission in 597 AD. Ethelbert issues a law code, the earliest surviving legal document in the Old English language. It is brief, it is crude by comparison with later law codes, but it is there. Written words, the silence is ending. Within a generation, the other major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are converting, sometimes enthusiastically, sometimes reluctantly, often through a combination of political calculation and genuine religious experience. The Northumbrian king, Edwin, converts in 627 AD. The East Anglian king, Sigebert, who has spent time in exile in Frankish Gaul, returns with continental education and founds schools and a monastery. Everywhere the church goes, it brings writing. And with writing comes history. Not accurate history, not comprehensive history, but attempts to make sense of the past, to establish narratives about how the current order came to be, to legitimize the power of the new kingdoms by tracing their lineages and their connections to both the Germanic past and, increasingly, to biblical and classical precedents. The stories that emerge from this first generation of writing are already shaped by the needs of the present. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms want histories that justify their existence and their dominance. The British kingdoms of the West want histories that explain their loss and preserve the memory of a great past. The Church wants histories that frame everything in terms of sin and redemption, of God's judgment on a fallen people. All of these agendas shape what gets written and what gets forgotten. The actual experiences of the people who lived through the 5th and 6th centuries, the farmers and the warriors and the refugees and the survivors, almost never make it into the record. We hear the great names, the kings and the bishops and the warriors. We almost never hear everyone else. One of the most poignant figures to emerge from the end of the silence is a man named Patrick, not St. Patrick of Ireland, but another Patrick, a Briton, a man who was, by his own account, born into a Romanized family in Western Britain, kidnapped as a teenager by Irish raiders, sold into slavery in Ireland, escaped, returned to Britain, received a religious calling, and then, extraordinarily, went back to Ireland as a missionary. His Confessio, a short autobiographical text, is one of the few genuine first-person voices we have from anywhere close to this period. He is writing in the mid to late 5th century. His Latin is good but not elegant, the Latin of someone for whom it is a learned language, not a native one. He is clearly operating in a world that is already substantially disrupted from the Roman norm. He makes no mention of Roman administration in Britain. He is essentially a man in a world where Rome has already become a memory. Patrick is remarkable for many reasons, but for our purposes, what matters is what he represents. He is a survivor. He is a Romanized Briton, navigating the collapse of his world and finding a new role, a new purpose, a new identity in the midst of that collapse. He ends up in Ireland, which was never part of the Roman Empire, and he becomes one of the foundational figures of Irish Christianity, which in turn becomes one of the most important forces in the preservation and transmission of learning throughout the early medieval period. The Irish connection is crucial and often underappreciated. Ireland, which was never conquered by Rome, and thus did not experience the same catastrophic collapse as Roman Britain, became a refuge and a creative centre in the 5th and 6th centuries. Monasteries in Ireland, partly inspired by contacts with the British Church and with continental Christianity, became extraordinary centres of learning. They copied classical texts, wrote commentaries, developed new literary forms, maintained and transmitted a knowledge culture at a time when that culture was disappearing from most of Western Europe. The Book of Kells, that extraordinary illuminated manuscript, represents the culmination of this Irish monastic tradition. It dates from around 800 AD, but it stands on 2 centuries of accumulated craft and learning built during and after the Saxon Silence. And the Irish monasteries sent missionaries back to Britain, Columba to Iona in 563 AD, Aidan from Iona to Northumbria in 635 AD. These missionaries did not just bring Christianity, they brought books, they brought literacy, they brought connections to a surviving learned culture. They were, in a very real sense, carrying the embers of Romanized British civilization back into a landscape that had largely forgotten what that civilization felt like. The paradox is beautiful. Britain loses its Roman culture. That culture takes refuge partly in Ireland, which was never Roman. Ireland transmits it back to Britain in a form shaped by centuries of Irish creativity and innovation. The Old English literature that emerges from the Anglo-Saxon monasteries in the 7th and 8th centuries is written by monks, many of whom were trained in traditions that owe a great deal to Irish learning. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created in the scriptorium of the monastery on Lindisfarne in Northumbria around 715 AD, is a product of this fusion of Irish and continental styles, created in a kingdom that was itself a product of both Anglo-Saxon and Brittonic heritage. This is the world that emerges from the silence. Not a clean, simple world. Not a world where one thing replaced another. A world of layering and fusion and unexpected connections and survivals that should not have happened but did. A world shaped by 200 years of experience that left almost no written record but left deep marks in the landscape and the language and the genetic heritage of the people who live in Britain today. Let us spend some time with the archaeology of the period more carefully, because it rewards close attention and because it reveals things that the written sources simply cannot tell us. The cemeteries are one of the most important sources of evidence we have, because people bury their dead in ways that reflect their beliefs, their identities, their sense of belonging to particular communities and traditions. And the cemeteries of 5th and 6th century Britain show patterns that are both revealing and puzzling. In eastern England, we find large furnished burial grounds, places where the dead were buried with their possessions, weapons and jewelry, and tools and vessels. This is a Germanic burial tradition. Roman Britain had generally used either cremation or simple inhumation without grave goods, influenced partly by Christian sensibilities. The return to furnished burial, and particularly the inclusion of weapons in male graves and elaborate jewelry in female graves, marks the presence of people who identified with a Germanic cultural tradition. The jewelry is particularly useful for tracing connections because it can be compared with material from across the North Sea. And what the jewelry shows is that the incoming settlers came from multiple different areas of the continental coastline, not from a single defined homeland. There are styles that connect to the Anglian areas of modern Denmark and Schleswig. There are styles that connect to the Saxon regions of modern northwestern Germany. There are styles that connect to the Frankish territories of modern Netherlands and Belgium. The incoming population was not a single unified group, but a mixture of peoples from across the North Sea region, pulled by whatever combination of push factors in their homelands and pull factors in Britain was operating in the 5th century. What were the push factors? Population pressure in the homelands is often cited. There is archaeological evidence that the coastal regions of the Netherlands and northern Germany were experiencing environmental stress in the 4th and 5th centuries, with rising sea levels threatening low-lying settlements. Flooding would have been a powerful motivation to seek new land. There is also political instability on the continent, with the upheavals of the migration period displacing peoples in complex chain reactions. And there may have been a tradition of raiding and mercenary service in Britain that predated the settlement period and established connections and knowledge of the island that made it a known destination rather than an unknown one. The pull factors are more obvious. Britain was wealthy, by the standards of the time. Its fields were productive. Its infrastructure, though beginning to crumble, was still visible and impressive. The political vacuum created by the Roman departure created opportunity. If you could establish yourself in this landscape, There was land and resources available in ways that were not available in the more densely settled and more politically contested continental homelands. The burial record also shows something else important. It shows change over time. The earliest Germanic cemeteries in Britain are quite closely related in style to continental Germanic burials. Over time, they develop distinctive British characteristics. They begin to incorporate elements that are native to the British context: local materials, local stylistic influences, hybrid forms. This is not the burial record of a static population maintaining an unchanging ethnic identity. It is the burial record of a community that is actively evolving, taking on new characteristics as it interacts with the landscape and the other people in it. And some of the burials show very clearly that this was not a racially exclusive community. There are burials in early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries that, when the genetic analysis is done, show ancestry patterns more consistent with native British heritage than with continental Germanic heritage. These are people who were buried in the Germanic style, possibly spoke a Germanic language, were part of the Anglo-Saxon community in every social and cultural sense, but who were genetically more similar to the Britons than to the continental Germanic peoples. They were Britons who had become, in every meaningful social sense, Anglo-Saxons. This is a process we might call elite emulation or cultural assimilation. The incoming Anglo-Saxon culture was the culture of power, of political authority, of military success. Attaching yourself to that culture, adopting its language and its customs and its burial practices, was a rational strategy for survival and advancement. The genetics suggest that this happened to some extent even in the most heavily settled areas of eastern England. But it is also worth noting that the reverse seems to have happened, at least occasionally. There are burial sites in areas that were predominantly Anglo-Saxon culturally, where the genetics tell a different story, where individuals show ancestry patterns more typical of continental Germanic peoples, but are buried in ways that suggest they had been absorbed into communities that maintained older British traditions. The borders between communities were not walls. People crossed them. Identities were negotiated and sometimes shifted. One thing that the burial evidence makes very clear is that the 5th and 6th centuries were a time of genuine violence. There are mass graves from this period, collections of bodies showing evidence of violent death. There are individual burials showing healed and unhealed injuries consistent with combat. This was not a peaceful transition. Whatever the relative balance between migration and local cultural change, the period involved real conflict, real bloodshed, real people killing each other. But it is important not to let the violence obscure the rest of the picture. Violence was part of the story, but it was not the whole story. Across these 200 years, most people, most of the time, were not fighting. They were farming. They were raising children. They were making pots and tools and jewelry. They were trading and traveling and talking and intermarrying. The human texture of this period, the daily life that was being lived while kingdoms rose and fell and peoples collided, is almost completely invisible to us. But it was there, and it was in many ways more typical of the period than the battles that later writers seized on. The farming evidence is particularly important, because it shows that through all the political upheaval and cultural transformation of the 5th and 6th centuries, the basic task of feeding people continued. The fields were ploughed, the animals were tended, the harvests were gathered. Whatever political authority was operating in a given area, whatever language people were speaking, whatever they were burying their dead with, the agricultural calendar continued to structure their lives. There are changes in the agricultural evidence that reflect the disruptions of the period. Some areas show signs of agricultural contraction in the 5th century, the reverting of previously farmed land to scrub or woodland, consistent with depopulation or the breakdown of organized agricultural management. But there is also evidence of continuity, of the same fields being farmed through the Roman and post-Roman periods in many areas. The land itself provided a kind of continuity even when everything else was changing. The pottery is another area where the evidence is striking. Roman Britain had a sophisticated pottery industry, mass-produced wares made on a wheel in dedicated kilns, distributed through trade networks across the province. The quality and diversity of Roman British pottery is impressive. And then, in the early 5th century, the mass production of pottery essentially stops. The kilns shut down. The distribution networks collapse. People start making their own pots again, by hand, in forms and styles that differ from the Roman tradition. This handmade pottery is coarser and simpler than what preceded it, but it is there. People were still making containers for food and drink. They had simply reverted to more local and more traditional methods of production. By the mid to late 5th century, new pottery styles begin to appear in eastern England, Germanic in character, influenced by the traditions of the continental homelands of the incoming settlers. These styles spread over time and eventually become the dominant pottery tradition of early Anglo-Saxon England, but even in this, we can see complexity. Some of the early Anglo-Saxon pottery shows influences from both the continental Germanic tradition and from late Roman British forms. The potters were not simply replicating what they had brought with them. They were adapting, borrowing, creating something new. The settlements of the period are deeply revealing. In the areas of heavy Anglo-Saxon settlement, the typical settlement form is the sunken featured building, a structure with a floor dug below ground level, typically oval or rectangular, with a beam for the roof ridge. These structures are very common in continental Germanic contexts and appear widely in 5th and 6th century England. They are the opposite of Roman architecture in almost every way. They are small, simple, impermanent, requiring no specialized labor or materials. They are the architecture of a people who are not building for permanence, who are not accumulating the resources to invest in stone, who are perhaps not certain enough of their tenure in a place to build for the long term. Alongside the sunken featured buildings are timber halls, larger rectangular structures that served as the main dwelling of an estate or settlement. These, too, are Germanic in character, reflecting the longhouse tradition of the continental homelands. The timber hall, with its open central hearth and its communal space, is the architectural expression of the social unit of the early Anglo-Saxon world, the household group organized around a lord and his followers. Neither of these building forms has any significant continuity with Roman British architecture. The contrast with the stone villas and townhouses of the preceding period could not be more stark, and it is this contrast that has sometimes been taken as the clearest evidence for the scale of population change. Because if you are a native Briton who has been living in or near a Roman building, why would you abandon that tradition entirely and adopt a completely new and in many ways less sophisticated architectural form? The answer, according to the population replacement model, is that you wouldn't. The people building sunken featured buildings and timber halls in 5th century England were not native Britons adapting to new circumstances. They were genuine newcomers, bringing their own traditions with them. But again, the picture is complicated by the Western and Northern evidence. In the areas that maintained British political authority, in Wales and Cornwall and the north, the building tradition does not shift to Germanic forms. It maintains its own trajectory, developing forms that have more continuity with late Roman and native British traditions. In some cases, people in these areas actually built in stone, continuing the Roman tradition of stone construction in a simplified form. In Wales, some of the early medieval royal sites show stone-built structures that, while modest by Roman standards, represent a genuine continuation of the stone-building tradition. The contrast between the Germanic timber architecture of lowland England and the continuing stone tradition of the British West is another piece of evidence suggesting that we are looking at genuinely different populations maintaining genuinely different traditions, not a single population that simply switched cultural models. Let us return to the question of how this period was experienced by the people living through it, because we have been looking at the period largely from the outside, through the evidence that later survives. But there is one source that tries, in its limited way, to give us the inside view: Gildas, the angry preacher, the man who wrote On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain sometime in the mid-6th century. Gildas is infuriating to historians precisely because he is not trying to be a historian. He is trying to be a prophet in the Old Testament mode, condemning a sinful people for their transgressions and calling them to repentance. He is not interested in facts as facts. He is interested in facts as illustrations of moral and theological arguments. His timeline is vague, his geography is vague, his names are sometimes wrong or at least inconsistent with other sources. He invents speeches for the characters in his narrative. But he is also, in his way, invaluable, because he is writing from inside this world. He is a man of the 6th century British West, probably from somewhere in the general area of southwestern Britain or Wales, writing for an audience that is still organized into British kingdoms, still speaking Brittonic languages, still Christian, still aware of being different from the Germanic peoples who have taken over most of the East. He is, in a meaningful sense, a survivor, and his rage and his grief and his frustration come through the Latin with an immediacy that the later sources lack. Gildas describes the collapse of Roman Britain in terms that have a raw emotional power. He describes the raids and the attacks and the burning of cities. He describes appeals to Rome for help that went unanswered. He describes a moment of resistance, led by Ambrosius Aurelianus, and a battle at Badon that gave his people a generation of relative peace. And then he describes the moral failure of the kings of his own time, their wickedness and their weakness, and he warns them of God's judgment. What Gildas does not describe is what was happening in the East, in the territory that had been taken over by the Germanic settlers. To Gildas, that territory is essentially lost. It is not his subject. He is writing about and for the surviving British kingdoms. The world of the Anglo-Saxon settlements is, to him, beyond the horizon of his concern. This itself tells us something. By the time Gildas writes, in the mid-6th century, the two worlds, the British West and the Anglo-Saxon East, are already sufficiently separate that a writer deeply concerned with the fate of his people can ignore the East almost entirely. The breach has opened. The two societies are developing separately, and Gildas does not seem to think there is any prospect of bridging the gap. The fact that Gildas survives, that his text was copied and preserved through the succeeding centuries, is itself remarkable. It was copied in Ireland and in the Welsh monasteries, and eventually in Anglo-Saxon England as well, where Bede used it as a source. The survival of Gildas is a reminder that even in the depths of the silence, texts were being made and preserved, just not in the areas and in the quantities that we would need to reconstruct a continuous narrative. There were other texts from this period that did not survive. We know this from references in later sources. Bede mentions documents that he had access to that we no longer have. The Irish annals sometimes reference events in Britain for which we have no other source. The Welsh triads preserve traditions that suggest access to narratives and genealogies that are no longer extant. The full extent of what was written and lost during and after the silence can only be guessed at, and the guessing is humbling. What would we know about this period if everything had survived? It is a question worth pausing on. If the administrative records of every post-Roman British kingdom had survived, if the chronicles that were presumably being kept in at least some monasteries through the 5th and 6th centuries had survived, if the documents generated by the early Anglo-Saxon settlements, the grants of land and the records of tribute and the genealogies of the leading families had survived from the beginning rather than only from the late 7th and 8th centuries onward, what would we know? We would know the names of the people who sat in those rebuilt hill forts and commanded the rebuilding of the defences. We would know what language they spoke at home and what religion they practiced and what they thought about the world they were living in. We would know what really happened at Badon Hill and who led the British forces. We would know the names of the Anglo-Saxon leaders who established the first settlements on the eastern coasts and how they organised their communities and what relationships they had with the native British population. We would know whether the stories about Arthur had any historical core, and if so, what that core looked like before the legend grew over it. We would know so much, and we know so little. And the knowing so little, the confronting of that silence, is itself one of the most profound experiences that engagement with this period can offer. It forces a kind of humility about what history is and what it can tell us. Most of what happened in human history was never written down, or was written down and lost. The written record is a tiny, skewed, fragmentary sample of the human past, preserved largely by accident and by the interests of the powerful. The Saxon Silence is just a particularly dramatic example of something that is true of history everywhere and always. But let us not end on that note alone, because the silence also invites a different kind of engagement. When the written record fails us, we are forced to turn to other kinds of evidence. And those other kinds of evidence, the archaeology and the genetics and the linguistics and the ecology and the place names, have generated a richness of understanding that would not have been possible in an earlier age. The tools we now have for reading the past without texts are extraordinary. Ancient DNA extraction from skeletal remains, LiDAR surveys that can see through vegetation to reveal buried landscapes, isotope analysis that can tell us where an individual was born and raised and what they ate. Palynology, the study of pollen preserved in bogs and lake sediments that can reconstruct the ancient vegetation and land use of a landscape over millennia. These tools are transforming our understanding of the Saxon Silence faster than at any previous point in the study of this period. Every few years, a new study appears that revises our picture in significant ways. The genetic studies of the 2010s and 2020s have been particularly transformative, and the research is ongoing. We now know, with a confidence that would have been impossible 20 years ago, that there was significant continental Germanic immigration into Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, especially in the East. We know that this immigration was not from a single homogeneous group, but from multiple continental populations. We know that the genetic turnover was geographically variable, higher in the East and lower in the West and North. We know that the boundaries between incoming and native populations were not absolute and that movement and mixing occurred. We know from the archaeology that the transition was accompanied by real violence, but also by real accommodation and cultural exchange. We know that the landscape itself was transformed, both physically through the abandonment and reuse of Roman infrastructure, and culturally through the adoption of new settlement forms and burial practices and craft traditions. We know from the linguistics that the language shift to Old English was profound and ultimately nearly complete in lowland Britain, with the Celtic languages surviving only in the politically independent West. What we do not know, and may never know with certainty, is the lived experience of it, the individual stories, the choices and the coercions and the compromises and the moments of grace and horror that constitute what it was actually like to be alive in Britain during the Saxon Silence. We do not know the name of the last speaker of Brittonic language in what is now Essex or Suffolk or Lincolnshire. We do not know what she or he said as the last time they spoke it, or to whom. We do not know what the first Anglo-Saxon child born on British soil thought about the landscape around them. We do not know what the two peoples said to each other when they met, in the mixed settlements where the genetics show us they were living alongside each other. We do not know the texture of the accommodation, the practical day-to-day working out of how to share a landscape, and eventually how to become, however imperfectly and unevenly, a single society. But we know it happened. We know that on the other side of these 200 years, there is a society that is new. That is neither Roman Britain nor the continental Germanic homelands of the incoming peoples. That is something genuinely novel, something that grew from the collision and the accommodation and the transformation of these 200 years. And from that society, in time, will grow kingdoms, and eventually a nation, and eventually a global empire, and eventually a language that is spoken as a first or second language by more people than any other language in human history. The English language, Old English, Middle English, Early Modern English, Modern English. This language, which you are listening to right now, is the direct descendant of the language of those incoming continental settlers. But it carries within it traces of everything it encountered along the way. Latin from the Roman period, absorbed before and during the settlement. Celtic traces, faint but real. Norse from later Viking settlement. Norman French from 1066. And it carries, in its very existence, the story of those 200 years when the record went dark and the old world ended and something new was being made in the silence. The silence is not simply a gap in our knowledge, it is the birthplace of England. And understanding that, sitting with the uncertainty and the complexity and the deep strangeness of it, is one of the ways we can come closest to understanding who we actually are and where we actually came from. The last thing to say about the Saxon Silence is about what it teaches us about history itself. Because history is always, to some extent, made from silence. Made from the gaps between the surviving evidence, from the documents that were not created or not preserved, from the people who were not literate or not powerful enough to have their stories recorded, from the everyday experiences that seemed too ordinary to write about. Every period of history has its silences. The Saxon silence is just unusually total, unusually dramatic, unusually complete. But in that very completeness, it illuminates something that is always true but usually hidden. The written record is not history. It is a trace of history. It is one kind of evidence among many. And when it fails us, as it does here, We are reminded that the past was lived by real people, in real bodies, in real landscapes. People who had experiences and relationships and beliefs and fears that the record can only occasionally and partially capture. The people who lived through the Saxon Silence were not living in a gap in history. They were living their lives. They were loving their children and burying their dead and tending their fields and telling their stories. The silence is ours, not theirs. We are the ones who cannot hear. They were speaking and singing and arguing and grieving and celebrating all along. And in the traces they left behind, in the bones and the pots and the buried objects and the place names and the linguistic fossils and the genetic echoes that now, with our extraordinary modern tools, we are beginning to be able to read, those voices are returning. Slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, but returning. The Saxon Silence is ending. Not because the records are being found, they are mostly gone forever, but because we are learning to listen in new ways, to hear history in the genome and in the soil and in the language and in the landscape, to reconstruct from silence itself a story that is richer and stranger and more human than any simple narrative of conquest and replacement could ever be. Britain in 410 AD is a Roman province. Britain in 600 AD is a collection of Germanic kingdoms and surviving British territories. The 200 years between those dates are where the real transformation happened, where the old world ended and the new world began, where the English were made and where the Welsh were made, and where the complex, layered, contested identity of the British Isles was forged in silence and violence and accommodation and time. We do not know exactly what happened, we may never know, but we know that it happened, and knowing that it happened, knowing the scale and the depth and the strangeness of it, is itself a form of knowledge that matters. It matters because it is true, and because truth, even incomplete truth, even fragmentary and contested truth, is what history is for. Somewhere, under the fields of eastern England, under the motorways and the retail parks and the housing estates, the evidence is still there, in the soil, in the bones, in the ancient seeds and the ancient pollen and the ancient traces of fires long cold, waiting for the tools and the curiosity and the patience to find it and read it. The silence speaks. We are only beginning to learn its language. Rest now. Let the darkness carry you back through the centuries of noise and record and history, through the Saxon Silence, through the fading of Rome, back to the bedrock of this ancient island, where human beings have been living and dying and loving and struggling for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought to write any of it down. The land remembers, the soil holds the record, and somewhere in the long darkness before sleep, in the quiet between thoughts, you can almost hear it, the sound of two worlds colliding, the sound of something new being made from the ruins of something old, the sound of the silence speaking. And yet the silence was not uniform. Even within the 2 centuries we have been exploring, there were pockets and moments where the record flickers back to life, where a name or a date or a fragment of testimony breaks through the darkness long enough for us to glimpse something real. These flickers are precious precisely because they are so rare, and each one, examined carefully, opens into a whole world of implication and uncertainty. Consider the name Vortigern. It appears in the later sources as the name of a British king or paramount ruler who is blamed for inviting the first Anglo-Saxon settlers into Britain. In Nennius's account, and in later tradition, Vortigern is the villain of the story. He brought in Germanic warriors as mercenaries to help him defend against raids from the Picts and the Scots, and those mercenaries turned on him and began the process of taking the island for themselves. The Germanic leaders in this tradition are named Hengist and Horsa, names that mean stallion horse, names that many historians suspect are mythological rather than historical, the kind of names you give to legendary founding figures in oral tradition. The story of Vortigern and Hengist has an obvious narrative logic. It is the story of the treacherous bargain, the fateful mistake, the moment when a desperate ruler makes a decision that leads to disaster. It is the kind of story that oral traditions love because it provides a dramatic and memorable explanation for how things came to be as they are, and it has just enough plausibility to resist easy dismissal. Germanic mercenaries were genuinely used by Roman authorities in Britain in the 4th century. The transition from Roman-sponsored foederati to independent settlers is not implausible. And Vortigern, unlike Hengist and Horsa, has a name that is authentically Brittonic, the name meaning something like High Lord or Overlord. But even if Vortigern was a real figure, what do we actually know about him? Essentially nothing that can be verified. The sources that mention him are all written centuries after his supposed lifetime. The story surrounding him has clearly been shaped by the narrative needs of later traditions. And the very fact that he is cast as the villain, the one who opened the door to disaster, suggests that the story has been constructed to explain a result already known, the loss of lowland Britain to the Germanic settlers, by assigning blame to a specific treacherous individual. This is a very common pattern in origin stories. When a great change happens that is experienced as a catastrophe, there is a powerful psychological need to explain it in terms of human agency and human failure. If we lost because of Vortigern's treachery, then the loss makes sense. It was not inevitable. It was a mistake. If only a different choice had been made, things might have gone differently. The story provides both an explanation and a kind of consolation. We could have been different. We were betrayed, not simply overwhelmed. Whether the story of Vortigern reflects any historical reality or whether it is entirely a later construction, we cannot know with confidence. What it tells us very clearly is how the later British tradition made sense of the loss of the lowland. And that making sense of is itself historically important. It tells us about the mental world of the people who transmitted this tradition, what they valued, what they feared, how they understood historical causation. Similar considerations apply to a whole series of figures from this period who appear in later sources but whose historical reality is uncertain. Ambrosius Aurelianus, the British leader mentioned by Gildas as having organized resistance to the Saxons. His name is interestingly hybrid, both the Latin Ambrosius and the Brittonic Aurelianus, suggesting someone from a Romanized British background. Gildas describes him as coming from a family that had worn the purple, a phrase suggesting imperial connections or ambitions. He may have been a genuine historical figure, a real military leader of the 5th century whose name was preserved in tradition. Or he may be partly or wholly a legendary construction built around real events. The question of what is genuinely historical and what is legend in this period is one that cannot be finally resolved. The tools for distinguishing them simply do not exist when the contemporary written evidence is absent. What we can do is read the sources carefully for the kinds of claims they make and the kind of evidence they cite, and assess the plausibility of their accounts in light of what the archaeology tells us. And what we generally find is that the broad outlines of the later tradition, the post-Roman fragmentation, the Germanic settlement, the period of conflict and gradual Anglo-Saxon dominance, are consistent with what the archaeology shows. The specific details, the names and dates, and individual events are often impossible to verify and sometimes clearly legendary. One of the most fascinating places where legend and possible history intersect is in the traditions about the island of Avalon and the mysterious West. In the later Arthurian tradition, Arthur is said to have been taken after his last battle to the island of Avalon, a place of healing and of the dead, somewhere in the mythological West. The name Avalon is connected to the Brittonic word for apple, avallo, and there is a tradition that identifies it with Glastonbury in Somerset, where a distinctive tor rises from what was once marshland. Glastonbury is a remarkable place, and its history in this period is genuinely complex. The Somerset levels, the low-lying, marshy ground around Glastonbury, were an unusual landscape, partly inhabited and partly wild, with the tor and its surrounding higher ground providing settlement sites. There is archaeological evidence of activity at Glastonbury through the Roman period and into the post-Roman centuries. And the monastery at Glastonbury, which claimed to be one of the oldest Christian foundations in Britain, had traditions connecting it to the earliest period of British Christianity. Whether any of the Arthurian associations of Glastonbury reflect historical reality is deeply uncertain. The most famous Arthurian connection, the supposed discovery of Arthur's grave at Glastonbury in 1191 AD, is widely regarded by modern historians as a medieval forgery, a convenient miracle produced by the monks to attract pilgrims and royal patronage after the monastery was damaged by fire. But the existence of the forgery tells us something real about the cultural power of the Arthurian tradition and about the way this period was mythologized in the medieval imagination. The West was a place of memory in a way that the East was not. In the East, the landscape had been so thoroughly transformed by Anglo-Saxon settlement that whatever British memories it had held were largely obliterated. In the West, In the British kingdoms that survived, the memory of the lost lowlands was cherished and mythologized. Prophecies attributed to Merlin and to other legendary figures spoke of a future British restoration, of a day when the Saxons would be driven out and the Britons would reclaim their island. The idea of Arthur's return, the sleeping king who would wake in his people's hour of greatest need, is the ultimate expression of this longing. A people who have lost most of their homeland, who have been reduced to the western margins of the island that was once theirs, looking east toward the lost territories and hoping. This hope was never realized in any historical sense. The British did not return to reclaim lowland England. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated their control through the 6th and 7th centuries and eventually unified into a recognizable early medieval state. But the memory persisted, and, in a strange way, it transformed over time. The Anglo-Saxons, the successors to the Germanic settlers who had taken the lowlands, eventually adopted Arthur as their own. The Norman kings, who conquered England in 1066 and who were descended from Vikings who had settled in northern France, found the Arthurian legend useful as a way of legitimizing their rule over both English and Welsh subjects. And so Arthur, the figure who began as a symbol of British resistance to the Saxons, became the founding myth of a kingdom that included the Saxons and their successors. The transformation of Arthur from British hero to British king, from symbol of resistance to symbol of national identity, is itself a product of the same processes that the Saxon Silence set in motion: the merging of the native and the incoming, the creation, over centuries, of something new from the collision of peoples and cultures, the building of a shared mythology out of the wreckage of the old certainties. Britain today is the product of all of this. The genetics of the British population reflect, in complex and regionally variable ways, the mixing that occurred during and after the Saxon Silence. The English language carries the traces of that mixing in its vocabulary and its structure. The landscape carries the traces in its place names and its earthworks and its buried remains. The cultural traditions of both England and Wales carry the traces in their literatures and their legal systems and their social customs. There is something profound about standing in a landscape and knowing that the story of how it came to be what it is runs through 200 years of near total silence. That the world you see around you, the fields and the towns and the roads, was made by people whose names are lost, whose stories are lost, whose individual experiences are lost, and yet whose collective action shaped everything that came after. The Saxon Silence is not just a gap in British history. It is a reminder that the most important things in history are often the things that happened when nobody was writing them down. The migrations of peoples, the collapse of old orders, the building of new ones, the daily accommodation between different communities that slowly, over generations, transformed a Roman province into a collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and British margins. None of that was narrated in its moment, all of it was lived. And now, 1,600 years later, we are trying to read it from the soil and the bones and the pollen and the genes. We are becoming, in our way, archaeologists of the silence, listening for the voices that were never written down, hearing them, faintly, in the earth itself. The silence is not empty. It never was. It was full of people, full of life and death and loss and survival, and the patient, stubborn human insistence on continuing even when everything that made life recognizable had been taken away. Britain endured the Saxon Silence. It came out the other side changed beyond recognition. And from that change, from that transformation, from that collision of worlds in the dark of the record, came something that had never existed before. England, and the long memory of what England replaced. Wales, both of them children of the silence. Both of them carrying it in their bones. Both of them speaking, every day, in languages and traditions that are the direct heirs of everything that happened in those 200 years when the record went dark. The Saxon Silence ended, but its echoes have never stopped. Now, let us go deeper into something that the conventional telling of this story almost always skips over: the experience of the landscape itself as a witness to what happened. Because Britain's geography was not a passive backdrop to these events. It was an active participant in them, shaping where people settled and where they fled, and where the different cultures held their boundaries and where they blurred. England is not a uniform landscape. Even within the relatively small area of what is now England, the variation is dramatic. The flat, open, fertile plains of East Anglia, perfect for agriculture and accessible from the sea. The dense forests and heavier clay soils of the Midlands, harder to clear and farm but offering resources of their own. The limestone uplands of the Cotswolds and the chalk downlands of Wessex and the south. The great river valleys, the Thames and the Severn and the Trent, that serve as highways through the landscape. The fens and marshes of Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire. The long Pennine spine running up through the middle of northern England. The Lake District hills, the Yorkshire moors. Each of these landscapes presented different challenges and opportunities to the people moving through them in the 5th and 6th centuries, and the settlement patterns of the period reflect those differences very closely. East Anglia was one of the earliest and most thoroughly settled areas. It faces directly toward the continental homelands of the incoming peoples. Its coast is accessible, its rivers navigable, its soil fertile. The archaeological evidence of early Germanic settlement is dense here. The cemeteries at Spong Hill in Norfolk, for example, contain thousands of cremation urns, one of the largest early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries known. The scale of this burial ground tells us something about the scale of the population that produced it. A substantial community maintaining its own cremation tradition, which was the dominant burial rite in many parts of the continental Germanic world, even as other areas were adopting inhumation. The Thames Valley was another early corridor of settlement. The river provided both a highway into the interior of the country and a defensive boundary between different territories. The Upper Thames region, around what is now Oxford, shows complex patterns of mixed British and Germanic material culture in the early decades of the settlement period, consistent with a landscape where the two populations were in contact and in some form of negotiation before the Germanic tradition became clearly dominant. The Midlands were settled more slowly. The heavy clay soils required greater effort to clear and cultivate. The forests that covered much of this region in the early medieval period were both a resource and a barrier. The place names of the Midlands include a notably high proportion of names ending in ley, which derives from the Old English word for a forest clearing, reflecting the process of woodland clearance that the Anglo-Saxon settlers undertook as they moved into this more heavily wooded territory. The zone of contact between the advancing Anglo-Saxon settlements and the maintained British territories shifted gradually westward over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries. For a period, there may have been a genuine frontier zone, a borderland where neither culture was clearly dominant, where mixed communities existed, and where individuals and families could move between cultural worlds with relative ease. The archaeology of some areas in the Midlands and the West Midlands suggests exactly this kind of borderland, with material culture that draws on both traditions and with settlement patterns that do not fit neatly into either the Germanic or the British model. The concept of a frontier zone is important because it challenges the simple binary of Saxon versus British that the later written sources tend to project onto this period. In reality, the zone of contact was not a wall, but a gradient, a landscape where cultural markers faded and blended as you moved from east to west, where the same person might speak both languages, identify with both communities, owe obligations to different lords who represented different traditions. This was a world of fluid identity, not of fixed ethnic categories. Some of the most interesting archaeology of the period comes precisely from this borderland zone, settlements where the material culture is genuinely hybrid, cemeteries where burials in the Germanic style and burials in the British style occur side by side, sometimes within the same grave, where the grave goods include both traditions. These sites are where the actual texture of the accommodation becomes visible, where we can see not the grand narrative of conquest and replacement, but the local, messy, individual reality of people from different backgrounds learning to live together. The movement of people was not only from east to west, from the settled Anglo-Saxon areas into the remaining British territories. There was movement in all directions. There were people moving from the British West into the Anglo-Saxon East, Britons who chose to seek their fortunes in the new order rather than maintaining their old identity in the shrinking territories of the West. There were people moving from the north into the south, refugees and migrants displaced by the political changes in the Brittonic kingdoms of the north. There were people moving from Ireland into Western Britain, the Scots who established themselves in what is now Western Scotland and whose kingdom, Dalriata, straddled the narrow sea between the two islands. The movement from Ireland into Britain in this period is particularly significant and often underappreciated. The Irish, who were Gaelic speakers, a different branch of the Celtic family from the Brittonic speakers of Britain, were establishing themselves in western Scotland and in parts of Wales and southwestern England throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. Some of this movement was raiding and slave-taking, as in the case of Patrick. Some of it was genuine colonization, and some of it was the movement of missionaries and churchmen, the movement that would eventually send Columba to Iona and begin the process of converting the northern kingdoms. The presence of the Irish in Western Britain added another layer of complexity to an already complicated ethnic and linguistic landscape. In some areas of Wales, Irish settlement left traces in the place names, and in the language, Irish loanwords absorbed into Welsh that are still there today. In Scotland, the Gaelic language of the Irish settlers eventually became the dominant language of most of the country, displacing both the Pictish languages of the east and the Brittonic languages of the south. Modern Scottish Gaelic is the direct descendant of the language that the Dal Riatan settlers brought from Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries. The Picts are another mysterious group whose story runs through the period of the Saxon Silence and who present their own interpretive challenges. The Picts occupied most of what is now Scotland, north of the Firth of Forth. They had a distinctive material culture, including the remarkable carved symbol stones that are one of the most striking artistic achievements of the early medieval period in Britain. These stones, with their complex knotwork and their mysterious symbols, appear across Pictland and represent a sophisticated artistic tradition that is native to this particular people. The Picts spoke a language of their own, or possibly languages. What survives of Pictish is fragmentary, preserved mainly in personal names and place names, and its relationship to other languages is debated. Some scholars think Pictish was a Brittonic language, closely related to the ancestral language of Welsh and Cornish. Others think it preserved features of a pre-Celtic language that predated the arrival of the Celtic languages in Britain. The evidence is too fragmentary to resolve the debate definitively. What we know is that the Picts were a formidable military force throughout this period. They had defeated repeated attempts at Roman conquest. They continued to raid into northern Britain after the Roman withdrawal. They were one of the threats against which Vortigern allegedly sought Germanic mercenaries, and they maintained their own distinct identity and culture until the mid-9th century, when the kingdom of the Picts was absorbed into the nascent kingdom of Scotland through a process whose details are also, fittingly enough, obscure. The story of the Picts is another piece of the Saxon silence that is very largely silence. We do not have a Pictish Gildas. We do not have a Pictish Bede. We do not have the voice of the Pictish people explaining their own history and their own understanding of this transformative period. We have their remarkable carved stones, their carved silver jewellery, the traces of their presence in place names across Scotland, and the brief references to them in the texts of their neighbours. It is enough to tell us they existed and mattered. It is not enough to tell us what they thought or felt. The same is true of the peoples of Ireland in this period, though here we are in a somewhat better position, because Ireland maintained a literate culture throughout and began producing annals and chronicles and legal texts from the 6th century onward. The Irish sources give us a perspective on Britain and on the events of this period from across the sea, a perspective that is different from both the British and the Anglo-Saxon viewpoint, and that sometimes preserves information available nowhere else. The Irish annals record plague outbreaks, battles, the deaths of kings, the activities of saints, in ways that occasionally shed light on what was happening in Britain. They are not comprehensive, and they are not always reliable, but they are there. Another strand of evidence woven into the complex tapestry. Let us think about what a person living through the later part of the Saxon Silence, say around 580 AD, in different parts of Britain, might have experienced. In eastern England, perhaps in what is now East Anglia, or Kent, or the East Midlands, you are living in a community that is thoroughly Anglo-Saxon in its culture. Your language is an early form of Old English. Your burial customs, should you die, would be furnished burial, your possessions placed in your grave. Your settlement is a collection of timber buildings, sunken featured buildings and halls grouped around the estate of a local lord. Your lord owes allegiance to one of the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Mercia or East Anglia or Deira or Bernicia. Your religion is pagan. You worship gods whose names are preserved in the days of the week: Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frigg's Day. There are priests and rituals and sacred sites, though these are not well documented because the people who would later write about religion wrote from a Christian perspective and were not interested in preserving the details of pagan practice. Your community may include people of mixed British and Anglo-Saxon ancestry. The genetics would show this if we could examine them. But culturally, the identity is Anglo-Saxon. The language is Anglo-Saxon. The material culture is Anglo-Saxon. Whatever British heritage exists in the community has been absorbed and hidden. A generation or two before you, or 3 or 4 generations before, depending on exactly where you are, the community your ancestors belong to may have been very different, more mixed, more uncertain about its identity, still negotiating between cultures. But by 580 AD, in most of Eastern England, that negotiation is over. The Anglo-Saxon identity has won. Not through a single dramatic act of conquest, but through the accumulation of generations of cultural pressure, social incentive, and demographic change. Now cross to the west. Imagine you are living in what is now Wales, or in the region that later sources call Powys, the great Brittonic kingdom of the central Welsh borderlands. Your language is a Brittonic language that is clearly ancestral to modern Welsh. You call yourself a Briton. You understand yourself as the descendant of the people who lived here when Rome was powerful, the people who were here before the Saxons came. You have a king. Your kingdom may be small, a single valley or a small cluster of valleys, but it has a court and a bard and a tradition of poetry in your language. The bards compose praise poetry for your king and elegies for the dead, and you hear it at the court feasts and you remember it. The court feast is one of the centers of your social world. The Hall of the King is where the community comes together for the great events of the year, for the feasting and the gift-giving and the stories that bind a community together. Your king gives gifts to his warriors and his bards. The bards praise him in return, the warriors pledge their service. The whole system is bound together by obligation and gift and story in ways that are recognizably similar to what you find in the Anglo-Saxon East, because this kind of heroic culture is not uniquely Saxon. It is common to the post-Roman world of the West as a whole. But you are aware of the Saxons. You know they are there, to your east. There may have been battles, raids, frontier conflicts. Your king may have fought them. The bards may sing of the struggle. And somewhere in the back of your mind is the knowledge that the territory to your east, the plains and river valleys that stretch toward the rising sun, was once British territory, was once part of a world that spoke your language and shared your traditions, and is now something else, something foreign, something that is advancing, slowly but without stopping, toward the hills where you live. This is a difficult knowledge to carry. The people of the British West in this period carry it. Gildas carries it, in his furious lament. The poets who compose the early Welsh poetry carry it. The tradition that will eventually produce the Arthurian legend carries it. It is the knowledge of loss, the knowledge of a world that was taken, that can perhaps be recovered, that must at least be remembered. And now imagine a third experience. You are living somewhere in the middle, in the borderland, in the zone of cultural contact and negotiation. Perhaps you are in what is now the West Midlands, an area of mixed settlement, of frontier. Perhaps your father was British and your mother was Anglo-Saxon, or vice versa. Perhaps you speak both languages, or perhaps you speak one primarily but understand the other. Perhaps you have a foot in both worlds, kin on both sides of the cultural divide. Your identity is harder to pin down than either of the other two people we have imagined. You navigate. You make choices about which identity to emphasize in which context. When dealing with the Anglo-Saxon lord whose land you farm, you present your Anglo-Saxon side. When visiting your mother's family in the Western Hills, you speak in her language and observe her customs. You carry both worlds inside you, and they do not always sit comfortably together. This third experience, the experience of the borderland, is probably the most common one during the period of most intensive contact and negotiation, and it is almost entirely invisible in the historical record. The historical record, when it begins to recover, tells the story of kings and kingdoms, of conversion and conquest, of clear cultural identities. The messy reality of borderland life, of mixed identity and negotiated allegiance, largely escapes it. But it is there in the genetics. The studies that show mixing even in the most thoroughly settled areas of the East. The studies that show persistence of British ancestry even in communities that are culturally thoroughly Anglo-Saxon. The borderland experience left its mark in the blood of the people who came after it. The story of Britain's Saxon Silence is, at the deepest level, a story about identity and its formation, about how people understand themselves and their place in the world, about how cultural identities are made and remade under pressure, about how belonging is constructed and how it changes when the external conditions that supported one form of belonging are suddenly swept away. The Britons of the Roman period had understood themselves partly through Rome. They were citizens of an empire. They spoke Latin in certain contexts. They used Roman goods and lived in Roman-style buildings and participated in Roman institutions. When those institutions vanished, the question of what they were, who they were, became urgent and unanswered. Some found their answer in Christianity. They were Christians in a world that was increasingly being occupied by pagans. Their religious identity became, in some contexts, their primary identity, the thing that distinguished them from the incoming Germanic peoples who worshipped different gods. Some found their answer in their language. They were Brittonic speakers in a world where Germanic speech was spreading. Their language became a marker of identity, a way of saying we are not them. Some found their answer in their genealogy. In the post-Roman British kingdoms, there was an intense interest in genealogy, in tracing descent from Roman or from legendary British ancestors, in constructing lineages that established a right to rule and a connection to the prestigious past. The genealogies of Welsh kings, preserved in later medieval manuscripts, trace their ancestry back through the post-Roman period, through the Roman period, and sometimes all the way back to legendary figures associated with Rome itself. This genealogical consciousness was a way of maintaining continuity with a past that was otherwise slipping away. The incoming Anglo-Saxon peoples had their own identity constructions. They traced their origins to continental homelands and to legendary Germanic ancestors. The royal genealogies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, when they are eventually written down, trace lineages back to Woden, the chief Germanic deity, establishing a divine sanction for royal power. As the kingdoms Christianize, this creates an interesting problem, because tracing your ancestry back to a pagan god is not entirely compatible with Christian theological expectations. The solution found by the Anglo-Saxon genealogists was creative. They inserted Woden into a longer genealogy that ultimately traced back to biblical figures, connecting the Germanic kings to the same universal human ancestry claimed by all Christians. This creative genealogical work is one of the places where the two worlds begin to blend in the written record. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, once Christianized, were not simply Germanic tribes transplanted into Britain. They were something new, something that had grown from the interaction between continental Germanic tradition and the particular conditions of Britain, including the remnant of Roman culture and the persistence of the Christian Church. The Christianity that the Anglo-Saxon kings adopted was not the same as the Christianity of the British West. It came partly through Rome and partly through Ireland. But it created a shared framework, a shared cultural space, within which the different peoples of Britain could begin to interact and eventually to construct a common identity. Bede, writing in the early 8th century, is one of the first people to attempt to construct this common identity in written form. His ecclesiastical history of the English people is remarkable for what it claims. He refers to the people of England as a single people, the gens Anglorum, the English people, even though in his own lifetime those people are divided into multiple kingdoms that are frequently at war with each other. The unity he invokes is religious, cultural, and linguistic, not political, but by naming it and writing about it, he is helping to create it. Bede is not straightforwardly sympathetic to the Britons. He follows Gildas in seeing the loss of their territory as divine punishment for their sins. He is dismissive of the British Church and its traditions in ways that reflect real ecclesiastical disputes of his time. But he is also, in some ways, a product of the very mixing we have been talking about. Northumbria, where Bede lives and writes, was one of the places where the encounter between Anglo-Saxon and Brittonic cultures was most intense and most productive. The monastery of Lindisfarne, which trained many of the scholars of Bede's generation, was founded by Irish missionaries and maintained Irish traditions of learning alongside Anglo-Saxon ones. The culture that produced Bede is already, by the early 8th century, a synthesis, not a pure anything. This is the legacy of the Saxon Silence, not a clean Anglo-Saxon triumph and a clean British defeat, not a simple replacement of one people by another, but a complex, regionally variable, individually negotiated transformation that produced something genuinely new, something that could not have been predicted from either of the starting points, something that we can begin to see by the time Bede is writing, and that we are still, in some sense, living within today. The England that emerged from the Saxon Silence became the world's most successful colonial power, spread its language around the globe, produced Shakespeare and Newton and Darwin and the Industrial Revolution, and gave its name to a language that is now spoken by more people than any other language in human history. None of that was inevitable. All of it grew from the collision and the transformation and the survival that happened in those 200 years when the record was silent. The silence was not nothing. The silence was where England was made, and Wales, and Scotland, in its own complicated way, and the whole tangled, layered, contested, richly complex story of what it means to be British. We have been sitting inside that silence for a long time tonight. We have walked through the collapse of Roman Britain and the fragmentation of its political authority. We have followed the incoming Germanic peoples as they settled the eastern coasts and moved inland. We have seen the British kingdoms of the West maintaining their language and their identity in the margins. We have looked at the evidence for what happened, the genetics and the archaeology and the place names and the law codes and the fragmentary written sources. We have sat with the uncertainty and the complexity and the irreducible mystery of it. The Saxon Silence is 200 years. It is a long time. Long enough for multiple generations to be born and live and die in the middle of it, never knowing what had come before or what would come after, only knowing the world as they found it. Those people, the ones who lived through the silence, are the ancestors of modern Britain in ways that go beyond genetics. They are the people who made the world that Bede and Gildas and Nennius and all the later historians tried to make sense of. They are the people who shaped the landscape of field and village that is still, in some places, recognizable in the English countryside today. They are the people who spoke the earliest forms of the languages that became Welsh and English, and whose choices and compromises and survivals echo down through all the centuries to the present. We do not know their names. We will never know most of them. But we know they were there. We know they mattered. We know the world we live in is, in part, their creation. And that is enough. That the knowledge of their existence and their importance, even in the absence of their names and their stories, can remind us that history is not only made by the powerful and the literate and the famous. History is made by everyone who lived through it. By the farmer ploughing the field in 5th century Kent who did not know or care that he was living through one of the most significant transformations in the history of his island. By the woman carrying water to her household in a post-Roman British town that was slowly falling into ruin around her. By the child learning to speak in a household where both languages were used. By the monk in his scriptorium carefully copying a text that would survive when most others did not. All of them were making history. None of them knew it. And the silence that covers them is not the silence of unimportance. It is the silence of lives too numerous and too ordinary to have been recorded by the few who had the power and the education and the material to write things down. The Saxon silence is every silence. It is just more visible than most, more dramatic, more complete. And for that reason, more instructive about what history really is and where it really happens. Not in the documents, in the lives. Britain endured. The silence passed, the voices returned. And what they said when they returned, what the record shows us when it resumes in the late 6th and 7th century, is the story of a world already transformed, already shaped by all those years of change, already carrying within it the seeds of everything that would come next. The Saxon silence was the crucible. What came out of it was Britain, complicated, layered, contested, and ours. Rest in that knowledge. Let it settle. The long dark of those 200 years, the darkness of the missing record, the darkness before the written voices return. And in that darkness, if you are quiet enough and patient enough, you can almost hear something. The sound of people making their world, as people have always made their world. In silence, that is never truly silent, in darkness that is never truly dark. England, Wales, Britain, all of them children of the years when no one was writing. All of them speaking the language of the silence even now. Even now, there is one more thread we need to pull before we let this silence close around us. One more piece of the puzzle that connects the Saxon silence to something much wider than Britain alone, because what happened here was not unique. It was part of a continental and even global process of transformation that reshaped the entire known world between the 4th and 7th centuries. And understanding Britain's silence in that larger context changes the way we see it. The late antique world, as scholars call the period roughly from 200 to 700 AD, was a world in transformation everywhere. Not just in Britain, the Roman Empire, which had provided the organizing framework for a vast interconnected civilization stretching from the Scottish borders to the Euphrates, from the Rhine to the Sahara, was fragmenting. In the west, the various Germanic kingdoms were establishing themselves on Roman territory. Visigoths in Spain and southern France, Vandals in North Africa, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in northern Gaul, Burgundians in the Rhone Valley. Each of these transformations involved its own version of the collision between the incoming peoples and the surviving Roman population. Each produced its own version of the complexity we see in Britain. Some of these transitions are much better documented than Britain's. The Frankish kingdom in Gaul, which became the ancestor of both France and Germany, left substantial written sources from the 6th century onward, including the remarkable histories of Gregory of Tours, written in the 580s AD. Gregory is himself a product of the transition, a bishop of Roman Gaulish origin serving in a kingdom governed by Frankish kings. His text gives us something that we lack for Britain, a contemporary voice describing a world in transformation. What Gregory describes in Gaul is, in many ways, similar to what we can infer for Britain, but with more detail. The mixing of populations, the adoption of Christian culture by the Germanic rulers, the persistence of Roman institutions, transformed but recognizable in the church and the law, the violence and the accommodation and the gradual creation of something new from the collision of the old order and the new. Gaul was Christianized before Britain, and more thoroughly. The church there had been more deeply established and was better organized. So, when the Germanic kingdoms took over, the church was there as a stabilizing and moderating force in a way that it was not so clearly present in Britain during the crucial early decades of the transition. This may be one reason why the transition in Gaul, while still dramatic and violent, was somewhat less complete a cultural break than what happened in Britain. The Latin language survived in Gaul and evolved into what became French. In Britain, the Latin-descended language that might have developed from the Brittonic Celtic substrate essentially vanished from lowland Britain, replaced by the Germanic Old English. This linguistic difference between the survival of Latin-derived language in Gaul and its replacement by Germanic in Britain has been extensively debated. One explanation focuses on the depth of Romanization. Gaul was more thoroughly and more continuously Romanized than Britain, which remained partially Celtic in its rural culture throughout the Roman period. The deeper the Romanization, the stronger the Latin base that survived the Germanic takeover. In Britain, with its shallower Romanization, the pre-Roman Celtic languages competed with Latin during the Roman period and may have reasserted themselves briefly in the post-Roman collapse before being themselves displaced by Germanic. Another explanation focuses on demographics. More Germanic settlers came to Britain relative to the native population than settled in Gaul. In Gaul, the Germanic groups were genuine minorities in a much larger Gallo-Roman population. In Britain, the balance may have been different, at least in the most heavily settled areas. A third explanation focuses on political structure. In Gaul, the Roman administrative structure survived in modified form under the Germanic kings. The Frankish kings largely adopted Roman institutions rather than replacing them. In Britain, the Roman administrative structure collapsed more completely, removing the institutional infrastructure that might have supported the survival of Latin culture. All of these explanations are probably partly right, and none of them is fully satisfying. The truth, as so often with this period, is that multiple factors were operating simultaneously, and that the outcome was not predetermined but contingent, the product of specific local circumstances and specific decisions made by specific people in specific situations. What is clear is that Britain's version of the late antique transformation was among the most dramatic and most complete. The cultural break was sharper here than almost anywhere else in the former Western Roman world. The silence in the record was more total. The emergence of something genuinely new and different on the other side was more complete. And perhaps there is something appropriate about that. Britain was always, in a sense, the edge of things, the far northwestern corner of the Roman world, the place where the legions went when they had nowhere further to go, the place that the classical world looked at with a mixture of fascination and condescension, simultaneously the most remote of civilized places and a land of mist and mystery beyond the edge of the map. That edge quality persisted. Britain became the edge of the Germanic world too, the far western extreme of the Anglo-Saxon cultural sphere. And then it became something else entirely, neither the edge of Rome nor the edge of the Germanic world, but its own thing, a collection of kingdoms with their own distinctive character, their own literature and their own art, and their own ways of doing things that were neither Roman nor continental Germanic, but something that had grown from the specific experience of this specific island in these specific centuries. Out of the edge comes something new. Out of the silence comes a voice. Out of the darkness comes the light that eventually produces the Venerable Bede and the Lindisfarne Gospels and the poem of Beowulf, that extraordinary epic which was composed in Old English, probably in the 7th or 8th century, by an English poet who was drawing on Germanic legendary tradition, but shaping it through the Christian culture of the Anglo-Saxon monasteries. Beowulf is neither purely Germanic nor purely Christian. It is something that could only have been made in the specific cultural environment of early Anglo-Saxon England, a culture that had emerged from the Saxon Silence and was finding its own voice. The voice that found itself in Beowulf, in the Lindisfarne Gospels, in the law codes and the charters and the first attempts at historical writing. That voice was the voice of a people who had come through something enormous and difficult and transformative, who were looking back at their own past, at the continental Germanic origins and at the Roman civilization they had encountered and absorbed, and forward at whatever was coming next, with a combination of pride and uncertainty and creative energy. The voice is also, in part, the voice of the Britons who survived and continued, and whose contributions, though largely invisible in the written record of the period, are nonetheless present in the genetic makeup and the landscape and the religious culture and the subtle linguistic traces that we can still detect if we look carefully enough. The Saxon Silence was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something, a beginning that is still, in a sense, ongoing, because the processes set in motion in those 200 years, the mixing of peoples, the formation of new identities, the transformation of landscape and language and culture, did not stop in 600 AD. They continued. They continue. Britain, in the 21st century, is still, in ways that often go unacknowledged, a product of the Saxon Silence. The English language that you are listening to right now is the most direct lineage, but so is the political geography. The existence of England and Wales and Scotland as distinct entities with distinct identities, which traces directly back to the settlements and boundaries established during and after the Silence. So is the legal tradition, English common law growing from the Anglo-Saxon law codes. So is the Church of England, whose peculiar form grows partly from the specific history of Christianity in Britain and its various Irish and Roman and British strands that all came together in the aftermath of the Silence. And so are the names, the place names that are Old English in origin, covering most of England, the place names that are Welsh or Cornish in origin, surviving in the West, the names that are neither, the pre-Roman names that survived because they were too deeply embedded in the landscape to be displaced, the rivers and the hills, and the oldest places that were named before anyone who is now living can remember. When you hear the name Thames, you are hearing a word that is more than 2,000 years old, a word that the pre-Roman inhabitants of the river's banks gave to that water, a word that survived Roman occupation and Saxon settlement and Norman conquest and 500 years of modern English evolution. It is still there, still in daily use. The river that flows through the heart of England still carries a name that was there before England existed. That persistence, that deep continuity, is both extraordinary and moving. It is a reminder that the story of Britain does not begin with the Romans or the Saxons or the Normans. It goes back much further. And the Saxon Silence, for all its drama and its importance, is one chapter in a much longer story that is still being written. The landscape will persist long after all the current voices go quiet. The Thames will flow, the hills will stand, and somewhere in the soil beneath your feet, in whatever corner of this ancient island you are resting on tonight, the evidence of all those past lives is still there, waiting, patient, enduring, as the people who lived those lives endured, through the silence and through the storm and through the long, slow transformation that made the world as we know it. They endured, and so do we, and so does the island, Britain, in silence and in voice, in darkness and in light, in the written record and in the unwritten memory of the earth itself. Still here, still speaking. Good night. But let us not leave this story without exploring one final and deeply strange dimension of it. The dimension that connects the Saxon Silence not just to the history of Britain, but to something that resonates far beyond these islands. The dimension that touches on the nature of memory itself, on how human communities preserve and transform the knowledge of their past, and on what happens to that memory when the structures that normally support it are destroyed. Human memory, at the level of the individual, is remarkable. We can hold an enormous amount of information in our heads. We can recall events from decades ago with surprising clarity. We can learn languages, master complex skills, remember the faces and voices and mannerisms of hundreds of people. The human brain is, in certain respects, the most sophisticated information storage and retrieval system that evolution has yet produced. But individual memory is also fragile. It fades, it distorts. It is subject to interference and to reinterpretation in light of later experience, and it dies with the person who holds it. Whatever an individual knows and remembers, that knowledge is not automatically transmitted to the next generation. It has to be actively shared, taught, passed on. Societies have developed two main ways of preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. The first is oral tradition, the passing of stories and songs and practical knowledge through speech and performance from person to person and generation to generation. The second is literacy, the encoding of knowledge in durable external forms, in writing and later in print and now in digital media, that can be stored and retrieved independently of any individual memory. Roman Britain relied heavily on literacy. The whole administrative, legal and commercial apparatus of the province depended on written records. The educated classes read and wrote. The bureaucracy produced and consumed documents in enormous quantities. Knowledge was stored externally, in archives and libraries, accessible to those with the education to use them. When the Roman structures collapsed, the literacy infrastructure collapsed with them. The archives were dispersed or destroyed. The scriptoria that had produced documents went out of operation. The educational system that had trained literate administrators broke down. And with the external storage of knowledge gone, everything had to go back into individual heads, into the older, more fragile, more limited storage of oral tradition. This is one of the most profound aspects of what the Saxon Silence represents. It is not just a period when things were not written down. It is a period when the whole relationship between knowledge and its preservation changed fundamentally. The civilization that had developed the external storage of writing had to revert, at least partially and temporarily, to the older and more limited system of memory and oral transmission. The consequences of this reversion were far-reaching. Knowledge that depended on cumulative written records could not be maintained without those records. The sophisticated legal and administrative traditions of Roman Britain could not simply be memorized and passed on orally in the way that, say, a traditional skill or a song could be. They required the infrastructure of writing to function, and without that infrastructure, they degraded rapidly. Some knowledge survived in the oral tradition. The names of places, the stories of great leaders and great battles, the practical knowledge of farmers and craftspeople, how to grow crops and tend animals and make tools, knowledge that had never depended on writing in the first place. The traditions of the church, maintained by communities of clergy who preserved at least rudimentary literacy throughout the period, and the deeper patterns of culture, the values and the social norms and the ways of seeing the world that are transmitted not through explicit teaching, but through the whole texture of daily life. These survived too, transformed by the new circumstances, but recognizably continuous with the past. But a great deal was lost. And the losses were not random. They were biased toward exactly the kinds of knowledge that writing is best at preserving: complex legal codes, detailed administrative records, precise dates and genealogies and transactions. The kind of knowledge that is too intricate and too detailed to be reliably preserved in oral form. The kind of knowledge that, in a society with writing, is routinely and almost automatically preserved, but in a society without writing, is extraordinarily vulnerable. This is why the archaeology becomes so important. The material record preserves things that the oral tradition could not: the shape of a pot, the form of a buckle, the layout of a building. These things carry information about the people who made and used them, information that the people themselves never thought to transmit explicitly because it was part of the background of their lives. It was just how things were done, and they had no reason to suppose that future generations would need to know about it. The pots and the buckles and the buildings have survived the silence in a way that the spoken words could not. They are fragments, they are incomplete, they require careful interpretation, but they are there, and they speak to us across 15 centuries with a kind of patience and persistence that the most elaborate oral tradition could not match. This is the paradox at the heart of our understanding of the Saxon silence. The period is silent because the written record is absent, but the material record is, in some respects, remarkably rich. It is just a different kind of record, speaking a different language, requiring different methods to read. And this is why the study of the Saxon silence is not, ultimately, a story of failure or of loss. It is a story of what happens when one system of knowledge preservation fails and another takes over, of what can be recovered by those who learn to read the new language, of what archaeology and genetics and linguistics and place name study can tell us that no written source could, because they access dimensions of the past that writing does not capture. In some ways, what we know about the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain is richer than what we know about some periods that have abundant written records. We know things about the genetic makeup of the population, about their diet, about their patterns of movement and settlement, that no written source from any period could tell us directly. The technology that gives us this knowledge is new, but the information it recovers is very old. The bones in the ground have been waiting 15 centuries to be asked the right questions. We are, in this sense, the first generation to begin to hear the full voice of the Saxon silence, the first to be able to supplement the fragmentary written sources with the evidence of ancient DNA and isotope analysis and LiDAR survey and all the other tools of modern science, the first to have, not just the words of later chroniclers trying to reconstruct a past they did not witness, but the direct evidence of the people themselves, preserved in their bodies and in the earth. This is an extraordinary moment in the understanding of this period. And it is not over. The research is ongoing. Every year brings new discoveries, new analyses, new revisions. The picture we have today is richer and more detailed than the picture we had 20 years ago, and the picture we will have 20 years from now will be richer still. What will we eventually know? We will know more about the specific regions and communities where the British population persisted and where the incoming Anglo-Saxon settlement was densest. We will know more about the timeline of cultural change, about how quickly and in what order different aspects of the transition happened in different places. We will know more about the diet and the health and the patterns of mobility of the people who lived through this period. We will know more about the ecological changes that accompanied the human changes, the shifts in land use and vegetation that the palynological record preserves. We will not know the names. We will not know the individual stories. We will not hear the voices that were never recorded. That silence will remain. But we will hear more of what it contained, more of the human reality that was lived inside it. And hearing more, we will understand more. Not just about 5th and 6th century Britain, but about how societies change and how identities form and how human communities endure catastrophic disruption and come through it, transformed but alive. These are not merely historical questions, they are present questions. They are questions that matter right now, in a world that is itself changing rapidly, in which old certainties are dissolving, and new identities are being negotiated, and the relationship between different peoples sharing the same landscapes is as fraught and as generative as it ever was. The Saxon Silence is not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror. Hold it up, and you see, refracted and transformed, something that is always happening, always has been happening, always will be happening. The meeting of peoples, the collision of cultures, the negotiation of belonging, the making of something new from the collision of the old. Britain did it 1500 years ago. The world is doing it now. And the outcome, as the Saxon Silence teaches us, is never simple, never clean, never what anyone planned. It is always something new, something that grew from the specific conditions of the specific moment in ways that no one predicted and that surprises everyone who comes later and tries to understand it. That surprise, that unpredictability, that irreducible complexity of human history is one of the things that makes the Saxon Silence so endlessly fascinating. It defies the simple story. It resists the clean narrative. It insists on its own reality, its own texture, its own stubborn refusal to be fully known. And in that refusal, in that residue of mystery, it remains alive. Not as a dead question from a dead past, but as a living puzzle that still has things to teach us, still has surprises in store, still has voices waiting to be heard. Listen. The soil is speaking. The bones are speaking. The rivers are speaking in their ancient names. The genes of the living people of Britain are speaking, carrying the trace of all that mixing and survival and transformation. The Saxon Silence is speaking. Even now, even here, even in the quiet of this moment, as you drift between waking and sleeping, between the present and all the accumulated past that made it. The silence has always been speaking. We are only now, slowly, learning to hear. And there is one more voice to listen for in the darkness of this period. One more thread that connects the Saxon Silence to the deep human past and to the deep human present. The voice of the landscape itself, not just as a physical geography, but as a living cultural terrain, marked and remembered and narrated by all the peoples who have moved through it. In the western parts of Britain, in Wales, and in parts of Cornwall, and in the old Brittonic territories, there is a remarkable tradition of what might be called topographic memory. The landscape is named and narrated and remembered in ways that encode its history and its significance. Mountains have stories, rivers have genealogies. Ancient sites are associated with particular figures and events in ways that preserve, however transformed, some memory of the people who gave those sites their significance. Some of this topographic memory is certainly very old. The lake at Llyn Cerrig Bach in Anglesey, where a collection of Iron Age metalwork was deposited in the water as votive offerings, is now known by a Welsh name that means something like the Lake of the Small Stones. The name tells us nothing about the Iron Age ritual significance of the site, but the site has been continuously known and named for more than 2,000 years, across the Roman period and the post-Roman period, and all the subsequent centuries. The name is a placeholder, a marker that says this place matters, even when the specific memory of why it mattered has been transformed or forgotten. This kind of topographic memory is one of the ways in which the deepest past persists into the present, even when the written record has long since moved on. It is the landscape speaking in the language of names, preserving the trace of all the human attention that has been directed at particular places across vast spans of time. Britain is covered with such names, covered with the accumulated naming of thousands of years of human attention. The oldest names, the rivers and hills, and prominent landscape features are often the most durable because they are the most frequently used and the most widely known. They survive transitions that erase almost everything else. The Saxon Silence did not erase these names from the landscape, even though it transformed the people who lived in it and the language they spoke. The incoming Anglo-Saxon settlers encountered a landscape that was already named, and while they renamed much of it in their own language, they also preserved many of the existing names, particularly for rivers and hills. The Thames, the Severn, the Avon, the Trent, the names that carry the sound of the Brittonic languages beneath the surface of English pronunciation. Every time you say the name of a river in England, and it does not sound quite Anglo-Saxon, you are speaking a word from the Saxon Silence. You are using the name that the people who lived through those 200 years, or their ancestors before them, gave to that water. You are, in that small moment, in contact with the world that the silence swallowed, and that the soil and the rivers have been quietly preserving ever since. That contact is more intimate than any written source can provide. The written sources describe the period at a distance, from the outside, looking back. But the river names are from inside it. They were spoken by the people who lived through it, in the landscape they lived in, and the echo of that speaking has persisted in the mouths of all the generations since. This is what the landscape of Britain offers that no other source can: direct, unbroken continuity with the world of the Saxon Silence. Not in documents or in monuments, but in the living practice of naming, the daily use of words that were already old when the last Roman soldier left these shores. The Saxon Silence was real. Its consequences were real. The transformation it encompassed was real and profound, and still shapes the world we live in. But it was never absolute. The rivers kept flowing and kept their names. The hills kept standing and kept their shapes. The fields kept being farmed and kept producing food. The people kept living and kept talking and kept passing down what they knew to the next generation, however imperfectly, however transformed. The silence was in the writing, never in the living. And now the living has resumed its voice. The written record returned. The literacy came back. The historians and the monks and the genealogists and the lawmakers began once again to create the documents that would eventually become the primary sources from which we know this period, or rather, the periods on either side of it. And we, 15 centuries later, sit in the gap between those sources and try to hear what was never written, try to reconstruct the lives of people who left no record of their names, try to understand a transformation so complete that it is still, in some ways, hidden from us. The Saxon Silence, 200 years, an island at the edge of the known world, the collapse of one civilization and the slow, painful, creative emergence of another, the meeting of peoples and the making of something new. It is one of the great stories of human history, and it is still being told. In the soil, in the genes, in the old river names, in the contested history of an island that has been home to so many peoples and so many identities that none of them can fully claim it as exclusively their own. Britain belongs to everyone who has ever lived in it and made it what it is. And that includes the people of the Saxon Silence, the nameless ones, the ancestors of both the English and the Welsh and the Scottish, the people who endured and survived and kept going even when everything that had defined their world had been taken away. They made us. In their silence, they spoke us into being, and the land remembers, even if we have forgotten, even if we have fallen asleep, even here, in the dark, in the quiet, between one breath and the next, the land is still speaking in its oldest voice, saying the oldest things, carrying the oldest memories. Listen, just listen, and sleep. There is something we have not yet fully explored that deserves its own space and its own careful attention: the question of religion. The spiritual life of the people who lived through the Saxon Silence. Because the religious dimension of this period is not merely background, it is central to what the silence was and why it matters. Britain, in 410 AD, is Christian. Not uniformly, not everywhere with equal depth, but the Christian Church has been established in Britain since at least the 3rd century and has achieved official status as the religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine the Great in the early 4th century. By the time the Romans leave, there are bishops in the major cities. There is a functioning ecclesiastical structure. British bishops attend church councils on the continent. The church is an institution, with all that implies for organization and record-keeping and the transmission of learning. The incoming Germanic peoples, by contrast, are pagan. They worship the Germanic gods, Woden, Thor, Frigg, Tiw, the gods whose names survive in the English days of the week, as clear as the fossilized bones of extinct creatures. They have their own religious practices, their own shrines and sacred sites, their own rituals and beliefs about the nature of the world and what happens after death. And their religion is not a minor cultural accessory. It is woven into the whole fabric of their society. Their kingship is conceived in terms of divine descent. Their warriors fight under the protection of their gods. Their farmers pray to their gods for good harvests. Their dead are buried with the goods they will need in whatever afterlife the Germanic tradition envisioned. The collision between Christianity and Germanic paganism is one of the defining conflicts of the Saxon Silence and its aftermath, and it plays out very differently in different parts of Britain. In the West, In the areas where British political authority maintained itself, Christianity survived and actually strengthened during the 5th and 6th centuries. The Church in Western Britain and in Ireland became, as we have noted, the primary institution for preserving what remained of Roman literary and intellectual culture. The monasteries that developed in this period became centres of learning and of artistic production. The distinctive monastic culture of the Celtic churches, with its emphasis on scholarship and manuscript production and individual spiritual discipline, is one of the great achievements of the Western British world during the Silence. The saints of this period are extraordinary figures. Saint David, the patron saint of Wales, is said to have lived through much of the 6th century. The details of his life, filtered through a biography written 5 centuries after his death, are largely legendary. But the tradition of his activities, his founding of monastic communities, his role in organizing the British Church, his emphasis on simplicity and scholarship, these reflect real patterns of activity in the Church of this period. David is a real figure in the sense that the traditions around him are anchored in real 6th century ecclesiastical culture, even if the specific stories are largely legendary. Saint Columba, the Irish missionary who founded the monastery at Iona in 563 AD, is better documented. We have a biography written by Adomnan, abbot of Iona, about a century after Columba's death. Adomnan's Life of Columba is one of the most remarkable texts to survive from this general period. A vivid and detailed account of a man who was simultaneously a holy man, a political operator, a scholar, and a community builder. Columba's foundation at Iona became one of the most important religious and cultural centres in Britain and Ireland for the next several centuries. And it was from Iona that the mission to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria eventually came. In 635 AD, the monk Aidan left Iona to establish a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, just off the Northumbrian coast. From this base, he and his successors carried Christianity into the Anglo-Saxon world in ways that shaped the whole subsequent history of English Christianity and English culture. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was a process that unfolded over the course of the 7th century, not all at once but kingdom by kingdom, with setbacks and reversals and political complications. The mission of Augustine to Kent in 597 AD began the process from the south, working through the kings who were closest to the continent and most influenced by Frankish Christendom. The Irish mission from Iona and Lindisfarne worked from the north. Between them, they converted most of the Anglo-Saxon world within a century of the end of the Saxon Silence. The conversion was not purely spiritual. It had enormous practical and political consequences. Christian kings gained access to literate clergy who could help them administer their kingdoms. They gained connections to the wider world of Christendom, to Rome and to the Frankish kingdoms and to the whole international network of the Christian Church. They gained prestige, the prestige of belonging to the most sophisticated civilization in the known world, and they gained the services of the Church as a record-keeping and document-producing institution, which is one of the reasons why the written record begins to recover so dramatically in the late 6th and 7th century. The transition from paganism to Christianity in the Anglo-Saxon world was also not a simple replacement. The new religion absorbed and transformed elements of the old. Old sacred sites became Christian holy sites. Old sacred times were reinterpreted as Christian festivals. The deep structure of Germanic religious practice, the emphasis on the relationship between the Lord and his followers, on gift-giving and loyalty and honor, was absorbed into the new Christian framework rather than simply abolished. The result was a Christianity that was distinctively Anglo-Saxon in its cultural texture, a synthesis that could not have existed anywhere else. We can see this most clearly in the literature. Beowulf, the great Old English poem, is the product of this synthesis. It is a Christian poem about a pre-Christian world. It uses the poetic forms and the heroic values of the old Germanic tradition to tell a story that is shaped by Christian theological understanding. The monsters it describes, Grendel and his mother and the dragon, are figures from the old mythological world interpreted through the lens of the new religion. They are evil, in the Christian sense. The hero who fights them is virtuous, in both the old Germanic sense of the great warrior and the new Christian sense of the righteous man. Beowulf is possible only because of the Saxon Silence. Only in a world where the Germanic pagan tradition and the Christian tradition had been forced into contact and conflict and eventual synthesis, could a poem like Beowulf have been conceived and created. It is the literary monument of the transformation we have been tracing throughout this long night. And the Lindisfarne Gospels, created around 715 AD in the monastery founded by the Irish mission, are the visual equivalent. This illuminated manuscript combines the insular art tradition that had developed in Ireland and in the British monasteries with the influence of Mediterranean Christian art that came with the Roman mission. The result is something utterly distinctive, something that could only have been made in this specific cultural environment at this specific moment when all these traditions were coming together. The Lindisfarne Gospels are not just beautiful, they are a record of the transformation that followed the Saxon Silence. They are evidence that the chaos and the loss and the displacement of those 200 years eventually produced not just destruction but creation, new forms, new syntheses, new things that had never existed before and could not have existed without the collision and the transformation that the silence encompassed. This is perhaps the most important thing the Saxon Silence teaches us. That transformation, even when it is catastrophic, even when it involves the loss of things of great value, is not only destruction, it is also creation. The Saxon Silence destroyed the Roman province of Britain. It destroyed the Christian and literate culture of the lowland towns. It destroyed the legal and administrative structures that Rome had built. These losses were real, and they were enormous. But the Silence also created. It created the conditions for the development of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Anglo-Saxon language and the Anglo-Saxon culture. It created the pressure that drove the Western British Church to its extraordinary achievements in scholarship and manuscript production. It created the encounter between Christianity and paganism that eventually produced the particular kind of Christianity that characterizes early medieval Britain. It created the mixing of peoples and cultures that gave Britain the layered, complex, richly textured character it has maintained ever since. The creation was not painless. The creation was not planned. The creation happened despite enormous suffering and loss, not in the absence of it, but it happened. And the world that emerged from it is genuinely remarkable, genuinely valuable, genuinely worth the centuries of scholarship and archaeological investigation and scientific analysis that have been devoted to understanding it. We are the inheritors of that world, the English language, the tradition of English common law, the landscape of England and Wales and Scotland, with all its ancient names and ancient field systems and ancient trackways, the genetic mixture of the British population, the tradition of Christian art and scholarship that stretches from the Lindisfarne Gospels through all the subsequent centuries to the present. All of it grows from those 200 years of silence. All of it carries, in its deepest structure, the marks of what happened when Rome withdrew, and the Germanic peoples came, and the native British population fought and accommodated and survived. You are, in a meaningful sense, a product of the Saxon Silence. If you are British, or if you speak English, or if you have any connection to the culture that grew from those 200 years, the silence is in you, in your language and in the cultural assumptions you carry and in the history you inherit, whether you know it or not. And now you know it, or you know more of it than you did before. The specific details, the names and the dates and the specific events, those are not the most important thing you take away from this long night spent inside the silence. The most important thing is the understanding of what the silence was, what it meant, what kind of human experience it encompassed. It was the experience of a world ending and a new world beginning. The experience of people who did not choose to be at the hinge point of history but who found themselves there, and who had to make their lives in the midst of it, as people always do, without the benefit of knowing how it was going to turn out. The farmers who kept ploughing their fields even as the political world above them dissolved and reformed in new configurations. The warriors who fought and died in battles that were not recorded. The mothers who raised their children in languages that might be displaced within a generation. The monks who copied manuscripts in scriptoria that might be burned before the ink was dry. The kings who built hill forts and assembled followers and tried to maintain some kind of order in a landscape that was genuinely and dangerously disordered. All of them, living their lives in the silence, making the best decisions they could with the information they had, loving their people and protecting what they could protect and losing what could not be protected and continuing anyway. Because continuing is what people do. It is what we have always done. Through every catastrophe and every transformation and every period of uncertainty and loss and change, we continue, we adapt, we make something new from the materials at hand. We find ways to be human even when the structures that supported a particular form of humanity have been swept away. The Saxon Silence is a story about that, about the human capacity to endure and to continue and to create even in the midst of loss. And it is a story that ends, not in triumph exactly, but in persistence, in the survival of enough to make something new. In the emergence, slowly, painfully, over generations, of a world that was neither what had been nor what any single vision had intended, but something real and vital and capable of producing, in time, Bede and Beowulf and Lindisfarne and all the rest. That is the legacy of the silence, not just the loss, the creation, not just the ending, the beginning. Britain went into the silence as a Roman province. It came out of it as something else entirely, something that would, in the fullness of time, become one of the most consequential places in human history. Not because of anything that was planned or foreseen in those chaotic centuries, but because of what the people of those centuries managed to build from the ruins of what had been. We are living in the shadow of that building. We speak the language it produced. We walk the landscape it shaped. We carry in our bodies the genetic signature of the mixing it encompassed. The Saxon Silence is not over. It is still happening, in the long, slow reverberations that echo from that transformative period down through all the centuries to the present. We are still, in some sense, inside it, still living with its consequences, still shaped by what those 200 years of darkness and creation made of the world. The silence speaks. In the river names and the field patterns and the DNA of the living, in the carved stones and the buried artifacts and the linguistic fossils of a language that absorbed everything it encountered, in the churches that stand on Roman foundations and the roads that follow Roman lines and the laws that grew from Anglo-Saxon codes, in all the traces, visible and invisible, of the long transformation that the silence encompassed. And now, finally, after this long journey through the darkness of those 200 years, let the silence of sleep take you. Let the words fade and the images dissolve and the questions rest. Let the ancient landscape recede into the comfortable darkness of rest. You have spent a long time in the silence tonight. You have heard what it had to say, or at least some of what it had to say. You will carry some of it with you into whatever comes next, whatever dreams or waking or further nights of exploration await. The Saxon Silence endured, the people who lived through it endured, Britain endured, and so will you. Rest now. The rivers are still flowing. The hills are still standing. The ancient island is still here, still carrying its deep and complex and never quite fully told story, patient under the stars that have watched over it through all the ages of its long and troubled and extraordinary history. Sleep. The silence will keep. It always has. There is a village in Oxfordshire, small, unremarkable to anyone passing through. A church, some houses, a pub, fields around it. The church itself is old, obviously old, with the particular gravity of age that some old English churches carry, a gravity made of stone and time and the accumulated prayers of generations. If you look closely at the walls of that church, you will find something remarkable. Built into the fabric of the medieval stonework, there are fragments of Roman brick, red, slightly different in shape and texture from the medieval material around them, but unmistakably Roman. Someone, in the 10th or 11th century, when the present church was being built, picked up Roman bricks from somewhere nearby, probably from the ruins of an earlier Roman building, and used them. They were good material. Why waste them? This is a small thing, a practical decision about building materials, but it contains a whole story in miniature. The Roman past was not gone. It was not merely a distant memory or an abstract historical concept. It was physically present in the landscape, in the form of actual bricks that could be picked up and used. The people who built that church were not Romans. They were English, speaking a Germanic language, organized in a society that had grown from the Anglo-Saxon settlement, but they were using Roman materials, quite literally building the new on the foundations of the old. This is what the Saxon Silence ultimately looks like in the landscape. Not a clean break between two separate worlds, but a continuous accumulation in which the materials of each period are incorporated into the next, sometimes consciously and sometimes just because they are there and they are useful. The landscape of Britain is built from the layered materials of all the different periods that have contributed to it. Roman roads beneath medieval tracks beneath modern highways, Roman sites beneath Anglo-Saxon settlements, beneath medieval villages, beneath modern towns. The past is always present, always being built upon and built into. The silence did not separate Britain from its past. It transformed Britain's relationship to its past. The past was still there. The earthworks and the ruins and the roads were still there. But the understanding of what they meant had changed. The people who came after the silence no longer had the institutional memory that could tell them what a Roman forum had been for or who had built that villa on the hill. They knew perhaps in a vague way that these were old things, things from before, that they had been made by the giants of an earlier age, as some medieval traditions have it, that they were the work of a world that was not their world. But they used them anyway. They ploughed Roman fields and settled on Roman sites and recycled Roman building materials and maintained Roman roads when it was practical to do so. The continuity was practical rather than cultural, purposeful rather than commemorative. The new society was not trying to preserve the Roman past, it was using what was there, unself-consciously, the way any society uses the landscape it finds itself in. And this practical continuity is itself a form of connection across the silence. The farmer who ploughs the field that was once part of a Roman villa estate may have no memory of what that villa was or who owned it, but the field is still there. The drainage ditches that the Roman estate manager ordered dug may still be functioning. The shape of the landscape that was established during the Roman period may still be structuring the lives of people who have no idea that it was once something very different. Landscape continuity of this kind is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the Saxon silence. It is not dramatic. It does not appear in any written source. It leaves no clear archaeological signature of its own. But it was real, and it connected the post-Roman and early medieval world to the Roman world in ways that the collapse of the institutional and cultural structures could not entirely sever. The same is true of the agricultural landscape. The field systems of Roman Britain were not invented from scratch. They built on prehistoric and early historic traditions of farming that went back far earlier than Rome. The basic patterns of how land was organized and farmed in Britain were already ancient when the Romans arrived, and those patterns shaped what the Romans built, just as what the Romans built shaped what came after. The Saxon Silence disrupted the overlay of Roman administrative and economic management, but the underlying landscape patterns that went back far deeper in time were more resilient. Modern landscape archaeology, using aerial photography and LiDAR survey, can see these patterns in the British landscape with extraordinary clarity. Ancient field systems, boundary banks, trackways, the accumulated decisions of generations of farmers, all visible from above as crop marks and soil patterns and shadow effects on the carefully surveyed surface. And what the surveys reveal is both continuity and change, a landscape that has been continuously and intensively managed for thousands of years, but that has also been repeatedly reorganized and reconfigured in response to changing economic and political conditions. The Saxon Silence shows up in this landscape record as a period of some agricultural contraction in certain areas, the reverting of some fields to scrub or woodland, and then a recovery and reorganization as the Anglo-Saxon settlements established themselves and the new agricultural regime took hold. But the recovery is not a reinvention. It is a reuse and a reshaping of what was already there. The new farmers were working in a landscape that had been shaped by all the farming that had come before, and their own farming in turn shaped the landscape for all the farming that would come after. This is the long view of the Saxon Silence. Not the dramatic view of political collapse and cultural transformation, though that view is also true and important. The long view of quiet, persistent human activity in the landscape, the farmer and the field, generation after generation, the politics changing above and around them, the languages changing, the religions changing, the names of kings changing, and the field still being ploughed, the soil still being turned, the crops still being grown, the food still being produced. Because in the end, whatever else changes, people need to eat, and someone needs to grow the food, and that someone, in every generation throughout the Saxon Silence, was there, in the field, with the plough, not writing anything down, not making anything that would be recognized as history, just farming, just continuing the essential work of feeding the community, the work that is always the foundation of everything else, the work that makes all the other work possible. We do not know their names. We will never know their names, but we know they were there. The fields prove it. The continuity of agricultural activity through the silence, visible in the pollen records and the soil profiles and the field systems that survive in the landscape, proves it. Someone was farming these fields through the 5th century and the 6th century and into the 7th, through all the political upheavals and cultural transformations and migrations and conflicts. Someone was there, doing the essential work. And those people, the anonymous farmers of the Saxon Silence, the people whose names we will never know and whose stories we will never hear, are as much the makers of what came after as any king or bishop or warrior whose name has been preserved in the record. More so, perhaps, because without them, without the continuous production of food through those 200 years, nothing else would have been possible. The kings would have had nothing to rule. The bishops would have had nothing to organize. The warriors would have had nothing to fight for. The Saxon Silence was sustained by the labor of people who left almost no direct trace in the historical record, but who were the foundation of everything. This is true of almost every period of history. But in the silence, where the record is so sparse, it is unusually visible. The absence of the usual records forces us to think about what was actually happening, about the human reality underneath the political and cultural surface, and what was actually happening was farmers, farming, always, through everything. Farmers, farming, and now, truly, the night is late. The silence has spoken its last words for this evening. The long journey through those 200 years is drawing to its close. The rivers are still flowing, the hills are still standing. The ancient fields are still lying in the dark, under whatever sky covers them tonight. The Saxon Silence was real. It was 200 years of transformation and loss, and creation and survival. It was the time when one world ended and another began. It was the time when the people of Britain found out who they were, when all the structures that had told them who they were swept away. And the answer they found, however painful and however incomplete and however different from what any of them had expected or hoped for, was something genuinely new, something that had never existed before, something that became, in time, England and Wales and Scotland, and all the complex, layered, contested, richly human mess of what it means to be British. The silence made all of it. In 200 years of unrecorded life and death and struggle and accommodation and creation, and the rivers still remember, and the fields still hold it, and the bones in the earth still carry it. And somewhere in the languages you speak and the laws you live under, and the names you use for the places around you and the genetic code that builds your body, the Saxon Silence is still speaking, still here, still real, still yours. Now sleep. The old island is watching over you, as it has watched over every generation that has lived and breathed and dreamed upon it since the first people made their fires here and looked up at the same stars you cannot see tonight through the roof above you, but which are there. Nonetheless, as they always have been, patient and indifferent and brilliant in the dark. Sleep. The silence keeps. Before we close this night entirely, there is one last thought that belongs here, one last thing to take with you into sleep. The people of the Saxon Silence were not waiting for history to remember them. They were not thinking about how they would be understood by people 15 centuries in the future. They were not performing for posterity. They were living, fully, completely, in the only way that any person in any age can live, in the present moment of their own experience. The farmer getting up before dawn to tend the animals did not think of herself as a historical actor. The warrior riding out to a border skirmish did not imagine that his story might eventually be incorporated into a legend so powerful it would shape 1,000 years of literature. The monk, carefully copying a manuscript in a cold scriptorium, did not know that his work might survive when almost everything around it perished and reached the hands of people who would treasure it as one of the most beautiful objects ever. Created by human hands, they were just living, doing what needed to be done, being who they were in the world they found themselves in. And that is the final lesson of the Saxon Silence. Not just that history is made by anonymous people as much as by famous ones. Not just that the record is fragmentary and that the past was richer and stranger and more complex than the record lets us see. but that the past was lived. By real people, in real bodies, with real fears and real hopes and real loves and real griefs, and the whole enormous weight and texture of actual human experience. The silence was not an absence of life. It was an abundance of life that simply did not leave the kind of traces we know how to read. And we are only now, with the new tools and the new methods and the new questions that our own moment makes possible, beginning to learn to read what it did leave. The Saxon Silence is speaking. Across 15 centuries, across the gulf of unrecorded time, in the soil and the bones and the old river names and the ancient field patterns and the genetic code of the living, listen for it, in the dark before sleep, in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the deep background of everything that the present moment is built upon. The silence speaks, and you are its heir. Good night. There is one more piece of evidence for the Saxon silence that deserves its own moment, its own quiet consideration before this night fully closes. It comes not from a dig or a laboratory or a library, but from an activity that seems, at first, entirely unrelated to the study of ancient history. It comes from the movement of clouds. Dendrochronology is the science of reading tree rings. Every year, a tree grows a new ring of wood, and the thickness of that ring reflects the conditions of that growing season. Good years produce wide rings. Bad years, cold and wet or hot and dry, produce narrow ones. By comparing the ring patterns of living trees with those of preserved ancient timber, scientists have built up continuous records going back thousands of years. And what the tree ring records from Britain and from across the northern hemisphere show for the 5th and 6th centuries is striking. The rings narrow dramatically around 536 AD and remain narrow for several years afterward. This is the signature of the Great Dust Veil event, a climatic catastrophe caused by massive volcanic eruptions that threw enough material into the upper atmosphere to reduce sunlight across the northern hemisphere. The cooling and the crop failures that followed contributed to the plague of Justinian and to the demographic crisis that was already afflicting the post-Roman world. This event, which happened right in the middle of the Saxon Silence, helps explain some of the things that archaeology shows us about the period. The agricultural contraction, the population decline, the sense, visible in some parts of the evidence, of a world that was genuinely struggling to sustain itself. The 6th century was, by any measure, a difficult time to be alive in Britain or anywhere else in the Northern Hemisphere. The climate was working against people even as the political and social structures that had supported them were already compromised. And yet people endured, through the dust veil and through the plague, and through the political fragmentation, and through the cultural transformation, and through all of it, they endured. The tree rings narrow, and then they widen again as the climate recovers. The plague kills, and then the population begins to recover. The political chaos eventually resolves into new and more stable structures. Life continues. It always continues. The narrowing of the tree rings in 536 AD is one of the most immediate and physical pieces of evidence we have for the conditions of the Saxon Silence. It is a moment when the climate itself was participating in the transformation of Britain, when the sky was darker, and the summers were colder, and the harvests were poorer, and the future looked genuinely uncertain to anyone alive at the time. And from that darkness, from that cold, from that uncertainty, the world that followed was made. Not in spite of the difficulty, but through it. The trees show us that. The rings narrow, and then they widen. The silence falls, and then the voices return. That is the final word of the Saxon Silence. The rings widen, the voices return, the land endures. And so do we. Britain breathes. The ancient island breathes in the dark. The rivers run their old courses and carry their old names. The hills hold their shapes. And somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the roads and the fields and the towns and all the accumulated weight of 15 centuries of history that came after, the Saxon Silence is still there, patient, enduring, speaking in the only language it has, the language of what remains, of soil and bone and stone and blood, the oldest language, the truest language, the one that never stopped. Sleep well, the silence keeps you.